The morning Lydia Rowan lost everything, the sun was shining. That was the part she could never quite forgive. Not the cruelty, not the lies, not even the crowd that stood watching. It was the indifferent brightness of that October sky, clear and gold as a promise, while Martin Delacroix stood on the steps of Blackstone's only bank and told everyone within earshot that she had stolen from him. $40, he announced, loud enough for the women by the dry goods store to hear, loud enough for the men outside the saloon to turn their heads. $40 and my grandmother's brooch, gone from my desk drawer. And the only person with access to that office, he paused, letting the silence do his worst work for him, was her. He didn't even look at her when he said it. That was what broke something open in Lydia's chest. Not shame, not grief, something older and colder than either of those. The particular devastation of realizing that a man you trusted had decided, very calmly, that your life was worth less than his convenience. If you've ever stood in a public place and felt the precise moment a crowd made up its mind about you, then you already know what happened next. And if you've never experienced that, if you've been lucky enough to keep your good name intact through all the years of your living, then stay with this story, because what comes next will ask you a question you may not be ready to answer. What would you do if everything you'd built was taken in a single morning, and the only person who offered you a hand was a stranger the whole town had already warned you about? Subscribe to this channel and follow Lydia's story to the very end, because what unfolds in Blackstone will remind you that the most powerful thing a person can carry isn't money, or reputation, or even hope. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Lydia Rowan had lived in Blackstone for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days before Martin Delacroix destroyed her in approximately 6 minutes. She had counted those months because they had cost her something. Moving west had not been the adventure the pamphlets described. It had been hard travel, harder work, and the slow, unglamorous business of building a name from nothing in a town that didn't ask where you came from, but watched everything you did. She had taken in mending. She had cleaned rooms at the Cartwright Hotel on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She had copied letters for men who couldn't write and kept her opinions to herself when those letters contained things she found distasteful. She had been, in every way she knew how to be, careful. Martin Delacroix had changed that. He ran the land office on Meridian Street, a narrow building wedged between the assayer and a feed store, with a wooden sign that swung and banged in any wind above 30 miles an hour. He was 43 years old, with the kind of face that suggested former good looks worn down by poor choices. He dressed well. He spoke smoothly. He had hired Lydia 6 months earlier to keep his files organized and copy his correspondence, and he had paid her fairly enough that she hadn't questioned the small discomforts, the way his eyes tracked her when she moved through the office, the remarks that weren't quite inappropriate but were never quite appropriate either, the habit he had of standing a little too close when he reviewed her work. She had told herself it was manageable. She had told herself a great many things in those 6 months that turned out to be wrong. The trouble had started 3 weeks before Martin stood on those bank steps. She had found, buried in the back of a file drawer she'd been reorganizing, a set of land documents that didn't match, claim numbers that appeared twice, survey boundaries that overlapped in ways that shouldn't have been possible unless someone had deliberately redrawn them. She hadn't understood everything she was looking at. Land law was not her expertise, but she had understood enough to know that something was wrong, and that whoever had created these documents had done so with considerable care. She had made the mistake of asking Martin about them. Not accusingly, not even suspiciously, or so she'd believed. She had simply set the 2 conflicting documents on his desk one Thursday morning and said quietly, "I found these filed together. I think there may be an error in the claim numbers. Should I bring it to someone's attention?" Martin had looked at the documents. He had looked at her. And then he had smiled, a slow, careful smile that didn't involve his eyes at all, and said, "Leave those with me. I'll sort it out." She had left them with him. 2 days later, he told her he had no more work for her. A week after that, a woman at the dry goods store turned her back mid-conversation when Lydia walked in. A day after that, the hotel manager told her, with visible discomfort, that her services were no longer required on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She hadn't understood yet. She had thought it was a run of bad luck. She had thought she'd done something wrong that she wasn't aware of. Then came the morning on the bank steps. Lydia had been walking to the post office when she heard her name. She stopped on the boardwalk, 20 feet away, and watched Martin Delacroix hold his small audience with the practiced ease of a man who had done this kind of thing before and found it effortless. "I didn't want to believe it," he was saying, and his voice had exactly the right note of reluctant sorrow in it. "She'd seemed like a decent woman. I gave her every benefit of the doubt. But $40 doesn't walk out of a locked drawer on its own." "You certain it was her?" someone asked. One of the men from outside the saloon had drifted over. "Only one with a key to the office," Martin said. "I've already spoken with the sheriff. He says without a witness, there's not much he can do, but—" He shrugged, and the shrug was almost kind, almost regretful. Almost. "People ought to know, that's all I'm saying. People in this town deserve to know who they're opening their doors to." Lydia stood very still. She was not by nature a woman who lost her temper in public. She had been raised to believe that dignity was something you kept even when everything else was stripped away. Standing on that boardwalk in the October sun, watching Martin Delacroix methodically dismantle the 2 years she had spent building something in this town, she understood for the first time in her life that dignity could be its own kind of trap, that sometimes what looked like composure was actually paralysis. She took 3 steps toward him. She didn't know, when she started walking, what she intended to do. She knew only that she could not stand still another second. Martin saw her coming. The smile didn't leave his face, but something shifted in his eyes. A small, quick adjustment, like a man recalculating odds. "Miss Rowan," he said pleasantly. "I know what you were just doing," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that, at least. "I never took anything from your office," she said. "You know that as well as I do, and I think—" She paused, because her heart was hammering in a way she could feel in her throat, and she needed a second. "I think you know exactly why you're saying this." The watching crowd was very quiet. Martin tilted his head with the patient expression of a man enduring a small inconvenience. "Miss Rowan, I understand you're upset. I found your land records," she said. The words were out before she'd fully decided to say them. She watched something move across Martin Delacroix's face, just briefly, just a flicker. And she knew, in the particular way you sometimes know things before you can explain them, that she had just made her situation significantly worse. "I don't know what you think you found," Martin said, and his voice had changed. The smooth sorrow was gone. What replaced it was quieter and considerably more dangerous. "But I'd be very careful, if I were you, about making accusations you can't support." "I'm not making an accusation," Lydia said. "I'm telling you that I know why you wanted me out of that office, and it has nothing to do with $40. Martin looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the people watching. "She's confused," he said simply. "It's a hard thing being caught in something like this. I don't hold any ill feeling toward her." And he walked away. The weeks that followed were the worst of Lydia's life, and she had survived some genuinely terrible weeks, so this was not a distinction she made lightly. The hotel took back her remaining hours. The woman whose children's clothes she mended sent her eldest boy over with the unfinished garments and a note that contained no explanation and no apology. The post office mistress began finding reasons to be occupied whenever Lydia came in to ask for her mail. 3 separate women she had considered something close to friends. Not close friends, but the functional kind, the kind who nodded warmly when they passed on the street, began nodding with slightly less warmth, and then not nodding at all. She had $12 saved. She had a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Cobble, who had not yet asked her to leave, but whose manner had cooled in ways Lydia felt without being able to precisely name. She kept herself occupied. She kept herself composed. She told herself every morning that she had done nothing wrong and that the truth had a way of eventually asserting itself, and she believed this about half the time, which was not particularly comforting. She applied for work at the laundry on Cedar Street. The owner, a heavy-set man named Purcell, listened to her explain her experience, looked at her for a long moment, and then said he'd think about it and let her know. He did not let her know. She went to the seamstress on the corner of Meridian and 3rd. The woman there was kinder about it. She apologized, genuinely, visibly uncomfortable, but the answer was still no. She tried the restaurant. She tried the school, where she'd heard the school teacher occasionally needed help with the younger children on Fridays. She tried 3 different ranches on the outskirts of town that had posted notices in the general store. Every door that opened closed again the moment her name was connected to Martin Delacroix's story. By the end of the 5th week, she had $8 left, and Mrs. Cobble had asked, with genuine seeming regret, whether Lydia might be making other arrangements soon, as there was a family in need of the room. She was sitting at the small table in that room on a Tuesday evening, trying to calculate how many days $8 could stretch, when someone knocked on the boarding house door downstairs. She heard Mrs. Cobble answer it. She heard a man's voice, low and unhurried. She heard her own name. She was down the stairs before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The man standing in Mrs. Cobble's parlor doorway was large in the way that came from actual labor rather than size. Broad through the shoulders, with hands that showed the kind of work that didn't come off with soap. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that had been weathered into something that might have been handsome once and had become more interesting in the process. He wore a good coat that had seen hard use, and he held his hat in both hands with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to do it. His name, Lydia would learn in the next 60 seconds, was Gideon Hale. She had heard of him. Everyone in Blackstone had heard of Gideon Hale. He owned the largest ranch in the surrounding territory, some 3,000 acres northeast of town, and he had the reputation of a man who managed it with impressive competence and complete indifference to social niceties. He had been married once, people said, and his wife had died some years back, and he had never shown any inclination toward remedying that situation. He employed a crew of 12 and kept largely to himself, coming into town for supplies and necessary business and nothing else. What Lydia did not know, looking at him in Mrs. Cobble's parlor doorway, was why he was here. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I've heard you're looking for work." Mrs. Cobble, behind him, was watching with an expression Lydia couldn't quite read, not hostile but carefully neutral, as though she were observing something whose outcome she wasn't prepared to predict. "I am," Lydia said. She kept her voice level. She had learned over the past 5 weeks to control the reflexive hope that jumped up at any possibility, because reflexive hope was something she could no longer afford. "I need a housekeeper," Gideon Hale said. "Someone who can manage the house and the stores and occasionally the men, when they get it into their heads that they don't need to respect the kitchen. The last woman I employed left in March. I've been making do since then, and I'm not good at making do." He said this last part without particular embarrassment, as a statement of fact. "Why me?" Lydia asked. It wasn't what she meant to say. She'd meant to ask about wages, hours, conditions, the practical questions that a sensible person asked. Instead, the 2 words came out, direct and slightly raw. Something shifted in Gideon Hale's expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recognition. "Because I have a crew that needs feeding and a house that needs managing," he said, "and you apparently know how to do both. And because—" He paused, and this pause was different from Martin Delacroix's pauses, less calculated. "I've been in this town long enough to notice the difference between a woman who stole $40 and a woman who asked the wrong question of the wrong man." The silence that followed was considerable. Mrs. Cobble made a small sound that might have been a held breath. Lydia looked at Gideon Hale for a long moment. She was looking for the angle, because there was always an angle, she had learned, and the men who appeared to have no angle were generally the ones with the most carefully concealed ones. She couldn't find it. "What are the wages?" she asked. He named a figure. It was fair, more than fair actually, fair enough to make her briefly suspicious. "Room and board in addition," he said. "You'd have your own room in the house. Not in the bunkhouse, not above the kitchen. Your own room with a lock." The lock was what decided it, though she didn't say so. "When would you need me to start?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "If that suits." It did not suit particularly, but Lydia had learned that need was largely indifferent to convenience. She was ready by 7 the next morning, with everything she owned packed into the 2 bags she'd come to Blackstone with 2 years earlier. Mrs. Cobble saw her off with a manner that was neither warm nor cold, carefully positioned somewhere in between, as though she were trying not to commit to any particular verdict on the proceedings. Gideon Hale arrived with a wagon at 7:10, said good morning, put her bags in the back, and handed her up with the same automatic courtesy as the hat holding. They drove north out of Blackstone in the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as simply present. Lydia watched the town fall away behind them. She was aware, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the 12 or 15 people who happened to be out on the main street at that hour of the morning had stopped to watch, that they would be talking about this before the wagon was out of sight, that by noon, everyone in Blackstone who hadn't already heard about Lydia Rowan would hear about her today, and the story would include Gideon Hale, and opinions would form rapidly and with complete confidence. She thought about saying something to Gideon about this. She thought about warning him. She had spent 5 weeks watching good people make calculations and conclude, not without some logic, that association with her was a liability. "They're watching," she said, because she couldn't quite stop herself. "I know," Gideon said. He didn't look back. "This will cause you trouble," she said. He considered this for a moment, in the unhurried way she was already starting to recognize as characteristic. "Most useful decisions do," he said. Lydia looked at the road ahead. She didn't say anything else for several miles, and neither did he, and the silence this time felt different, felt like something she was being allowed to occupy rather than something she was required to fill. The Hale Ranch was not what she'd imagined, though she wasn't sure what she had imagined. Larger, certainly. The main house was 2 stories, wood-framed with a long porch along the front, and 2 chimneys she could see from the approach. It had been built by someone with genuine intentions and maintained with functional competence. The structure was sound, the outbuildings in good repair, but it had the particular feeling of a place where no one had thought much about comfort in quite some time. The kitchen was the most obvious evidence of this. It was a large, well-appointed room that had been, at some point, genuinely well organized, and had since been subjected to several months of men making do. Lydia stood in the doorway and took inventory with the particular calm of someone who has learned that distress over fixable things is a waste of finite energy. Behind her, she heard what she assumed was Gideon Hale explaining her presence to someone. "Who is she?" A man's voice, younger, with a note in it that wasn't quite challenge but was getting there. "New housekeeper," Gideon said. "Name's Miss Rowan. You'll treat her accordingly." "She the one from town? The one that Delacroix said—" "I didn't ask what Delacroix said," Gideon said. His voice didn't change volume or temperature. "I told you her name and how you'll address her. That's the end of it." A pause. "Yes, sir," the younger man said, with the slightly deflated quality of someone who has reached the end of an argument before it properly started. Lydia did not turn around. She continued taking inventory of the kitchen. After a moment, she heard footsteps. Gideon's, she was already learning to distinguish them by weight, crossed to the kitchen doorway. "The pantry's through there," he said. "You'll find it roughly organized. I use the word roughly, loosely." She turned. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her with the kind of frank assessment that she was accustomed to finding uncomfortable but somehow didn't from him. "The man you were just speaking to," she said. "Is he going to be a problem?" "Caleb?" Gideon considered. "Only if you let him think his opinion matters more than his work. He's 19 and occasionally forgets those are different things." "What about the others?" 12 men, total. 3 of them will accept you within the week because they're practical and they can see what the kitchen's been. 4 of them will take longer because they need to form their own opinions before they'll commit to anything. 2 of them are likely to give you some variety of grief before they come around, but they'll come around. The other 3, he paused. "What about the other 3?" she said. "The other 3 will do what I say because I pay them," he said, which I realize isn't the same thing as respect, but it'll do while you're earning the other kind. It was, Lydia thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to her in quite a long time. "Fair enough," she said, and turned back to the pantry. The first week was the hardest. Not because of any single thing, but because of the accumulation of small tests that she understood were tests without anyone announcing them as such. Caleb, the 19-year-old, was exactly as Gideon had described, more interested in seeing what she'd do when challenged than in any actual antagonism. The first morning, he tracked mud across the kitchen floor she'd spent an hour cleaning and stood back with the careful inattention of someone waiting to see if there would be an explosion. She handed him a mop. She didn't say anything else. He stared at the mop for a moment as though it were an unfamiliar object. "The bucket's under the sink," she said, and went back to the stove. He mopped the floor. It took him longer than it would have taken her, and the result was imperfect, but she said nothing about that either. By the 3rd day, he had started bringing in wood for the stove without being asked, which was progress of a sort. The man who gave her the most genuine difficulty in those first weeks was not Caleb, but a wiry, weathered hand named Sutter, who had been with the ranch for 11 years and had accordingly developed opinions about how things ought to be done that were very difficult to dislodge. "We don't eat soup for supper," he told her on the fourth evening, looking at the pot on the stove with the expression of a man confronted with a moral failing. "You do tonight," Lydia said. "Mr. Hale doesn't eat soup for supper." "Mr. Hale ate 2 bowls of it last night and didn't say a word against it." Sutter opened his mouth and then closed it again. He ate the soup. Gideon, at the head of the table that evening, said nothing, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that might have been a suppressed smile. The part Lydia hadn't anticipated, hadn't let herself anticipate, because anticipating things led to being disappointed by them, was that the work itself would steady her. She had spent 5 weeks in Blackstone with nothing to do but think about what had happened and worry about what was coming. Here, there was always something that needed doing, and it needed doing in a concrete, physical way that left little room for the particular spiral of thought that had become her enemy. The kitchen needed organizing. The stores needed cataloging. The linen that had been roughly washed and inadequately folded for what appeared to be several months needed systematic attention. She threw herself into it with the focused intensity of someone who understood, at some level she hadn't fully examined, that keeping busy was the only thing standing between her and a grief she wasn't ready to feel. By the end of the second week, 3 of Gideon's 12 men had begun to treat her with something close to respect. By the end of the third, the kitchen was unrecognizable from what it had been, and the meals were the kind that men came to the table quickly for. Sutter had not apologized for the soup comment. She hadn't expected him to. But he had started with elaborate casualness, mentioning at breakfast what he particularly liked for supper, which she recognized as the closest thing to a peace offering she was likely to get. She was beginning, very tentatively, to feel something approaching settled. She was careful about this feeling. She didn't trust it. She was right not to. The first sign of trouble from Blackstone came on a Sunday, 3 weeks after she arrived. Gideon had ridden into town for supplies and returned later than expected with a set expression she hadn't seen on him before. He came into the kitchen where she was working, poured himself coffee, and stood at the counter with the posture of a man carrying something he hadn't decided how to set down. "Spit it out," Lydia said, without turning around. A beat of silence. "Royce Calloway stopped me in front of the general store," Gideon said. Royce Calloway was, as Lydia understood it, something of an unofficial leader among the town's more established families, not elected to anything but behaved as though he had been. "He wanted to discuss my hiring situation." "And what did he have to say about my hiring situation?" Lydia asked. "That it reflected poorly on my judgment," Gideon said. "That a man in my position had responsibilities to the community. That there were certain standards—" He stopped. He used the word standards 3 times. I counted. Lydia turned then, because she wanted to see his face. "What did you say?" she asked. Gideon looked at the coffee in his hand. "I told him that I found it interesting that a man so concerned with standards had apparently formed them from one side of a story," he said, "and that if he had a genuine concern about how I ran my ranch, I'd be happy to discuss it on my property, where he was welcome to come and see the state of things for himself." He paused. "He didn't take me up on it." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "He'll cause trouble," she said. "Probably," Gideon agreed. "You could still change your mind," she said, not because she wanted him to, because she felt she ought to give him the option. Gideon looked at her with an expression that was difficult to name, but not difficult to understand. "I hired you," he said simply. "That's not a thing I undo." Royce Calloway did cause trouble, and he did it in the slow, methodical way of a man who understood that patience was a more effective weapon than speed. He did not confront Gideon again directly. Instead, things started happening. The supply merchant in town, who had done business with the Hale Ranch for 9 years, suddenly had difficulty filling orders in a timely manner. 2 of the neighboring ranchers who had informal arrangements with Gideon about water rights and fence repairs began to find reasons to delay on their end of those arrangements. The banker, when Gideon came in to renew a line of credit he had held for 7 years without incident, mentioned that some additional review might be required. Gideon didn't tell Lydia most of this directly. She pieced it together from what she overheard and what she noticed about his expressions when he returned from town, and the conversation she occasionally caught the edges of between him and his oldest hand, a man named Theodore, who had a face like a granite shelf and had been with the ranch since before Gideon's wife died. One evening, she found Gideon at the desk in the study she rarely went into, with a spread of papers that she could see, even from the doorway, were financial in nature. She knocked on the door frame. He looked up. "You didn't eat supper," she said. "I forgot," he said. She looked at the papers. She looked at him. "Those are the cost overruns from the north pasture fence," she said, because she had helped file the receipts and she recognized the format. "And the delayed supply order, you're recalculating." He didn't deny it. "There's a margin," he said. I've run tighter." "But not while someone was actively making it tighter," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that meant she had said something accurate. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because Royce Calloway has decided that disliking my choices is more important than his own interests," Gideon said, "which is his problem." "It's your problem," Lydia said, "and I'm the cause of it." "You're the occasion of it," he said. There was a distinction in his voice that she would think about later. The cause is a man who'd rather punish someone for asking an honest question than deal with whatever reason she was asking it. Lydia stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'll bring you a plate," she said. "You don't have to." "I'm going to bring you a plate," she said, "because you didn't eat supper, and you're not going to solve anything on an empty stomach." She brought him a plate. He ate it at the desk. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the window in the dark for a long time, looking out at nothing, thinking about land documents with doubled claim numbers, and a man with a careful smile who had decided she was a problem worth eliminating. She thought about what she had seen in those documents. She had tried to push the memory away because dwelling on it felt dangerous, felt like touching something that could still burn. But standing in Gideon Hale's kitchen, in the life he was paying a price to let her have, she found she could not push it away anymore. She was going to have to do something about Martin Delacroix. She just hadn't figured out what yet. The thing about Gideon Hale, and Lydia was still learning this, still fitting together the shape of him from the pieces she'd observed, was that he was not a simple man operating on simple principles, despite the impression he gave. He was a man who had lost something enormous and had built a functional life in the hole left behind. She could see this clearly enough. The way he ran the ranch with total investment and total competence and nothing else. The way he ate his meals with efficiency and no apparent pleasure. The way he was good with his men in the manner of someone who had learned what loyalty cost and had decided it was worth the price but not the trouble of enjoying it too much. What she could not see, because he didn't show it, and she had not yet earned whatever it would take for him to show it, was whether there was anything in him that still wanted the parts of life that couldn't be achieved through competence. She wondered about this more than she wanted to. The afternoon. Caleb came in from the south field with a cut along his forearm that was deeper than he was admitting, and the kind of pallor that meant he'd been trying to ignore it since it happened. Lydia dealt with the wound with what she had on hand and the particular ruthlessness that good care sometimes requires. Caleb, to his credit, didn't complain. He went slightly white when she cleaned the wound, but he kept his mouth shut. "Hold still," she said. "I am holding still," he said through gritted teeth. "You're flinching. That's not the same thing." "It's the same enough," he said. She wrapped the arm. He looked at the bandage with an expression that contained, she thought, a revised assessment of something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. "Miss Rowan," he said. Did you really steal from Delacroix?" She kept her face level. "No," she said. He nodded, as though this confirmed something. "Figured," he said. "Based on what?" she asked, genuinely curious. He thought about it for a moment. "A woman who steals doesn't clean out a pantry for free," he said. "Seems like she'd be looking for easier ways to get what she needs." Lydia looked at him. 19 years old, with the particular mixture of rough edges and occasional startling perception that she was starting to recognize as his characteristic mode. "That's surprisingly logical," she said. "I have my moments," Caleb said, and then winced when he moved the arm wrong. "Keep that elevated," she said. "And if it starts swelling, you come tell me before you decide to be stoic about it." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She was almost back to the kitchen when she heard him add quietly to whoever was nearby, "She's all right." She kept walking. But something in her chest moved a little, in the manner of something that had been very tightly held for quite a long time. It was Theodore who told her, on a cold Thursday morning in the fourth week, that Gideon's wife had died in this house, had been sick for almost 2 years before the end, had been, by every account Theodore offered with the careful economy of a man who chose his words like he chose his tools, useful, nothing extra, a woman of considerable character. "He hasn't been the same since," Theodore said. He was mending a bridle at the kitchen table while Lydia prepared the noon meal, and he'd offered this information with the air of someone who had decided, after deliberate consideration, to offer it. "He seems functional," Lydia said. "Functional," Theodore repeated, and something in his tone made the word sound like an inadequate diagnosis. "You're telling me this for a reason," she said. Theodore set down the bridle. He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a man who had spent enough of his life reading weather and animals that he'd gotten very good at reading most other things too. "You're good for this place," he said. "Don't let what's coming from town make you think otherwise." "What's coming from town?" "More of the same," he said. "Calloway's not done. And Delacroix?" He paused. "There are rumors. He's saying new things now. Not just the $40. Lydia kept her hands moving on what she was doing, because stopping would mean acknowledging the cold that had moved through her. "What new things?" she asked. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then, "Questions about your character. General ones. The kind that don't have to be specific to do damage." She understood. General questions about a woman's character in 1887 in a frontier territory did not need to be specific to do considerable and lasting damage. They simply needed to exist, to float, to attach themselves to the existing story and become part of the texture of what people believed. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thought you should know what you're dealing with," Theodore said, and picked the bridle back up. That evening, after supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, Lydia sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and tried to write down everything she remembered about the documents she had found in Martin Delacroix's back file drawer. She was not a woman with legal expertise. She knew this. What she had seen were numbers that appeared twice and survey lines that overlapped, and she had known enough to know it was wrong, but not enough to know exactly what kind of wrong or what it meant or what could be done about it. She wrote what she remembered. She wrote the claim numbers she could still see, clear in her memory. She had always had a good memory for numbers, a useful trait in a life that had frequently required her to manage accounts. She wrote the names on the duplicate documents, the dates, the description of where the files had been hidden and what condition they were in. She folded the paper and put it under the false bottom in her trunk, where she kept the $7.40 that was all that remained of her savings. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark and thought about what it would take to get from what she had remembered to what she would need if she were ever going to make Martin Delacroix account for what he'd done. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had a piece of paper, and she had a memory, and she had a position from which she was no longer being thrown out. It was, she thought, more than she'd had a month ago. Outside, the wind had come up, the first real cold wind of the season, coming down from the mountains with the particular clean bite that meant winter wasn't a threat yet but was introducing itself. She could hear it moving around the corners of the house. She thought about Gideon Hale at his desk with his financial papers, recalculating margins in a problem she had brought to his door. She thought about Theodore's voice saying, "You're good for this place." She thought about Caleb's bandaged arm and his careful logic and the moment she had not allowed herself to feel entirely. She thought about what it meant to be in a place where someone had chosen to keep her, not despite what people were saying, but in full awareness of it. She got up, washed her face at the basin, and went to bed. She lay awake for a while, listening to the wind, and thought, "Whatever comes next, I will not run from it." She didn't know yet what would come next. She didn't know about the blizzard, or the rescue, or the choice that Gideon Hale would eventually make in front of the same people who were currently trying to take everything from her. She knew only that she was still here, and that still being here, when everything had been aimed at making her leave, was its own kind of answer to a question that hadn't finished being asked. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows of the house with a sound that was almost, if you listened to it a certain way, almost like the world rearranging itself around something new. The cold that Lydia had felt coming on that Thursday night arrived in earnest by the following Monday, and with it came the first real test of what she had been quietly building on the Hale Ranch. It wasn't the blizzard. That was still weeks away, gathering itself somewhere in the high mountains with the patience of something that didn't need to hurry. What arrived that Monday was simpler and in some ways more corrosive. Two men on horseback, riding up the main approach to the ranch at mid-morning, wearing the particular expression of people who had appointed themselves to deliver an unpleasant message and had convinced themselves this made them important. Lydia saw them from the kitchen window. She recognized one of them, a man named Fen Aldrich, who ran the feed store on Blackstone's Main Street and sat on the town council with the self-important gravity of a man who had confused administrative function with moral authority. The other she didn't know by name, though she recognized the type. The kind of man who attended things rather than initiated them, whose primary purpose in any gathering was to constitute a number. She did not go outside. She stayed at the stove and kept her hands moving and listened to the sound of boots on the porch and Gideon's voice, coming from the direction of the barn, crossing the yard to meet them. She couldn't hear what was said. The wind was wrong for it, coming from the east and carrying the words away. What she could hear was the cadence, Aldrich's voice rising and falling with the practiced certainty of a man making an argument he'd rehearsed, and Gideon's voice, flat and level and unchanging, offering nothing back that could be used. After 12 minutes, she counted, because she had nothing else to do with the anxious energy running through her hands. She heard the horses leave. She heard Gideon's boots cross the porch. The kitchen door opened. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter with the set expression she'd learned to read as the face he put on when he was deciding how much to say. "Aldrich," she said, "and a man called Pierce. He's Calloway's brother-in-law." Gideon drank his coffee. "They came to inform me that the council is considering whether my current hiring arrangement might constitute a disruption to community standards. They used the phrase community standards 4 times. I'm starting to think it's the only phrase they know." "What does that mean legally?" she asked. "A disruption to community standards." "Nothing," he said. "It means nothing legally. It's pressure, not law." "What kind of pressure?" He set down the coffee. "They have some informal influence over the water board. There's a secondary irrigation channel that feeds the south pasture. Not my water rights, a board allocation. If they chose to review the allocation, they could cut your water," she said. "They could make it complicated," he said, which was a more honest version of the same thing. Lydia turned back to the stove. She moved the pot that didn't need moving. She was thinking about her piece of paper with its column of remembered numbers, sitting under the false bottom of her trunk upstairs, and thinking about how much good it was doing there. "Gideon," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name, and she was aware of it, and she thought he was too, because something in the room changed slightly. "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "The reason I was dismissed from Delacroix's office. I told you it was because I found documents that didn't match. I didn't tell you what I think those documents mean." He waited. "I think Martin Delacroix has been filing duplicate land claims," she said, "recording the same parcels twice, under different names, and collecting fees for both. I think he may have been doing it for years. And I think—" She stopped. Organized what she actually knew versus what she suspected, because she was not going to guess in front of this man. "I think whoever those parcels belong to on paper, the second set of owners doesn't know there's a first set, or the first set doesn't know there's a second." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's land fraud," Gideon said. "Yes." "You're certain about what you saw?" "I'm certain I saw what I saw," she said carefully. "I'm not a land lawyer. I can't tell you with legal precision what it amounted to. But I wrote down what I remembered, and I have the numbers. And I think someone who knew what they were looking at could tell you exactly what it amounts to." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. He had the expression of a man revising a picture he'd thought was complete. "How long have you been sitting on this?" he asked. "Since the night Theodore told me Delacroix was spreading new rumors," she said. "I needed to think about whether it was something I could actually do anything with, or just something I knew." "There's a difference," he said, not disapprovingly. "I've learned to mind the difference," she said. He nodded slowly. Then, "There's a man in the county seat, name of Harlan Birch. He's a land attorney, been practicing for 20-some years. He handled the title work when I bought the north parcel 7 years ago." He paused. "He's not in Calloway's orbit." "Could you get a letter to him without it going through Blackstone's post?" she asked. Something moved in Gideon's expression that she was starting to recognize. A very slight shift around the eyes, the specific look of a man who had just found something useful to do with a problem. Theodore rides to Millfield twice a month for supplies. I can't get in Blackstone, he said. He leaves Thursday. That's 3 days, Lydia said. It is, Gideon said. Think you can write it in 3 days? She looked at him steadily. I can write it tonight, she said. She wrote it that night at the kitchen table after the house had gone quiet. 3 drafts before she had something she was satisfied with, not because she wasn't sure of the facts, but because she understood that the way you presented facts to a lawyer mattered considerably, and she wanted Harlan Birch to understand from the first paragraph that he was reading something precise rather than something hysterical. Women who wrote to lawyers about powerful local men could be dismissed very quickly on stylistic grounds alone, and she was not going to give Harlan Birch any stylistic grounds. The final version was 2 pages. It stated what she had found, described the documents as specifically as she could from memory, listed the claim numbers she had retained, and said plainly that she understood she was one witness with one recollection, and that she was not asking for anything except that someone with appropriate expertise look at the public land records and tell her whether what she remembered was consistent with what was there. She folded it, sealed it, and left it on the kitchen table for Gideon to review in the morning. She went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks, which surprised her. She thought about it afterward and decided it was because she had done something, finally, rather than simply enduring. Gideon read the letter at breakfast. He didn't say anything for a while after he finished it. You write clearly, he said. I was told it was a useful skill, she said. It is. He folded it carefully. I'll add a note of my own. Birch knows me. It won't hurt. I don't need your endorsement, she said, not sharply, but directly. Gideon looked at her. I know you don't, he said. I'm offering it anyway because it'll make him read yours faster. You can refuse it if you'd rather. She thought about this for a moment. Pride was a thing she could afford less and less. Fine, she said. Thank you. Thursday came and Theodore rode out with the letter tucked inside his coat, carrying also a particular expression of someone who understood the weight of what he was carrying without having been told explicitly. Theodore was like that. He absorbed information through some process that didn't require direct communication, and he acted on it with the same silent competence he applied to everything else. The days after Thursday had a different quality. Not easier, exactly. Aldrich and Pierce had returned once more, this time with a third man Lydia didn't recognize, and the conversation with Gideon had lasted longer. Sutter had come in from town with news that Delacroix had been seen having a long lunch with Royce Calloway at the hotel restaurant, which meant something was being arranged, though what exactly was not yet clear. But there was something to wait for now, and waiting with purpose was a different kind of waiting than waiting without it. In the meantime, the ranch occupied her completely. The stores needed replenishing, and she made careful lists, calculating what could wait for Theodore's monthly Millfield run and what needed to be sourced locally, in Blackstone, where she couldn't go herself because her presence in town would provide Delacroix's allies with opportunities she wasn't ready to handle. She sent Caleb for what was needed. He went without complaint, which told her more about how far things had shifted between them than any direct conversation would have. The men had sorted themselves into the categories Gideon had described in her first week, with some adjustments. 2 of the 4 middle group men had moved toward genuine respect without her doing anything in particular to earn it. She thought it was simply time and the daily evidence of meals that were hot and consistent and better than what they'd had before. One of the others, a broad man named Walt, who had the physical presence of a barn door and the conversational register of someone deeply uninterested in anything that required talking, had developed the habit of fixing things in the kitchen that she hadn't asked him to fix. A squeaking cupboard hinge, a stone in the hearth that had been loose for what looked like years. He did this without comment, and she received it without comment, and they understood each other perfectly. The 2 men Gideon had predicted would give her grief had given it, in minor and mostly stupid ways. Food left in wrong places, tools borrowed from the kitchen and not returned, one incident where someone had let mud get tracked across a floor she had just cleaned on purpose. She was virtually certain. She had dealt with each instance with the same approach, calm, direct, and without conceding any ground. She had been doing this long enough now that the attempts were decreasing in frequency, which she took as progress. It was during this period, in the relative stability of those particular days, that she started to learn the ranch itself. Not just the house, but the broader shape of the operation, the rhythms and the pressure points and the logic of how it fit together. She did this mostly through listening and paying attention, which were skills she had developed to a high degree through necessity. She learned which fields had water problems in dry years and which ones were reliable. She learned where the fences were weak and why. She learned that the north herd was stronger than the south, and that there was a particular gate latch on the east side that had been improperly hung and was going to fail in cold weather. She mentioned the gate latch to Gideon one evening. He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about the east gate?" he asked. "Caleb mentioned it was sticking," she said. "He said it was fine. I asked Walt to look at it." "Walt's a cattle hand." "Walt can also fix a gate latch," she said. "He told me so himself." Gideon was quiet for a moment. In that particular way that she had come to understand meant he was revising something, adding a piece to a picture. "The latch has been wrong since spring," he said. "I've been meaning to get to it." "Walt got to it this morning," she said, "while you were with the south herd." He nodded. Something in the nod felt like more than a nod about a gate. "You're paying attention," he said. "Someone has to," she said, which was more direct than she'd meant it to be, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped. But Gideon just looked at her with the expression she was learning to associate with something she didn't quite have a name for yet, something between recognition and discomfort, the look of a man confronted with something that mattered. "Yes," he said, "someone does." The letter from Harlan Birch arrived 3 weeks after Theodore had ridden to Millfield. It came not through the Blackstone post office, which would have meant anyone at that office knowing about it, but in Theodore's coat pocket on his next Millfield trip, where Birch had sent his response to the general delivery office rather than to any address in Blackstone. Theodore handed it to Gideon. Gideon brought it to Lydia. They read it together at the kitchen table, which was not something she had anticipated. She had expected him to hand it to her and step back. Instead, he sat across from her, and she spread the letter on the table and they read it in silence. Harlan Birch wrote with the compressed precision of a man who had been billing by the hour for a long time. He stated that he had examined the public land records for the relevant claim numbers she had provided, that he had found what he described as significant irregularities consistent with the type of fraudulent double filing described in your communication, and that he believed there was sufficient basis for a formal inquiry. He named 2 specific parcels that he was confident had been fraudulently recorded. He asked for a formal meeting, either in person or by further correspondence, and stated that this matter might involve not just local authorities, but the Territorial Land Office. He said one more thing, in the last paragraph, that made Lydia sit very still for a moment. The 2 of the fraudulent parcels he had identified were currently subject to a purchase agreement, meaning that someone was about to pay money for land that they did not, in any legal sense, yet own, because Delacroix had already sold the claim to someone else. "He's still doing it," she said. "He never stopped," Gideon said. She looked at the letter. She thought about the 2 years she had spent in Blackstone, trying to build something careful and small and sustainable, and the 6 months she had spent in Martin Delacroix's office thinking she had found something stable, and the single Thursday morning when asking an honest question had destroyed everything she'd built. "He needs to be stopped," she said. "Not just for me." "No," Gideon agreed. "Not just for you." "There are people about to buy land they won't actually own," she said. "When it comes out, and it will come out, they'll lose everything they paid." "I know." He tapped the letter once with one finger and then looked at her. "Birch wants a meeting. I can ride to the county seat next week." "I should come," she said. A beat. "It would be easier without you there," he said. "Not because—" He stopped, looked for the right words, and she appreciated that he was looking. "Birch doesn't know you. I do. The meeting would be smoother if I go first and lay the ground." "Smoother for whom?" she said. "For getting anything done," he said. "I'm not saying you can't handle it. I'm saying Birch will ask me how I know you, and I can answer that in person in a way that changes how he reads everything you told him." She thought about this. "You'll tell him the truth," she said. "I'll tell him you've been working on my ranch for 6 weeks, that I've seen your work and your character, and that I believe you," Gideon said. "Which is the truth." The word believe sat in the room for a moment with a weight she hadn't expected. "All right," she said. He rode out on a Tuesday. He was gone for 2 nights and came back on Thursday afternoon looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with the ride. He came into the kitchen, poured coffee, and stood at the counter. Birch is filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office, he said. He believes there are at least 7 fraudulent claims, possibly more. He's requested that the Land Office freeze any new transactions on the affected parcels until the inquiry is complete. How long will that take? She asked. Months, he said. This isn't fast. And Delacroix? Doesn't know yet. Birch was careful about that. He paused. He will know, eventually. When the Land Office contacts him, he'll know. And when he knows, he'll figure out where the inquiry came from, she said. Yes. She had already known this was the shape of it. She had known it when she wrote the letter. Knowing something was coming and being prepared for it were not the same thing, but she had learned that the gap between them could be managed. Then we'd better hope the inquiry moves faster than his ability to make trouble, she said. Birch is not a slow man, Gideon said, and the Territorial Office doesn't like being made to look incompetent. Fraud of this scale, in their records, they'll want it resolved. She nodded. Then, because she needed to ask it, how much did this cost you? The trip? Birch's time. Don't, he said. Gideon, it's not a debt, he said. Don't turn it into one. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to accept things without accounting for them, she said. It was more honest than she'd intended, but she was tired of managing every word. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she didn't have a name for yet. I know, he said. I noticed. The shift in the ranch's atmosphere in the weeks that followed was subtle but real. She couldn't have pointed to a single moment that caused it. It was more like the way a season changes, not on a particular day but through accumulation, until one morning you realize the quality of the light is different and has been for a while. Part of it was simply time. 6 weeks became 8, and 8 became 10, and the men who had been waiting to see if she'd stay had seen her stay. The kitchen had become what it was supposed to be, the functional center of the ranch's daily life. And with that came a kind of authority that didn't need to be claimed because it was simply evident. Part of it was the incident with the South Herd, which happened on a Wednesday in the 7th week. A section of fence on the southern boundary had failed, not the east gate, a different section further along, and 18 cattle had gotten through into rough country that bordered a dry creek bed. It was late afternoon when it was discovered, and the light was already going, and 3 of the hands who should have been available for the retrieval were dealing with a different problem on the north pasture. Gideon was in the far field. It would take 20 minutes to reach him. Lydia had learned enough about cattle operations in 10 weeks of careful attention to know that 18 animals loose near a dry creek bed in failing light was a situation that got worse quickly. She had also learned enough about the men remaining in the yard to know who was capable and who wasn't. She organized the retrieval herself. She did not make a speech about it. She did not ask permission. She walked to the barn, found Caleb and Walt and 2 other men whose names she had learned, and told them plainly what needed to happen and in what order. Caleb stared at her for approximately 2 seconds. "What are you looking at?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and went to get his horse. By the time Gideon reached the south field, the fence break had been located and temporarily patched. 16 of the 18 cattle had been retrieved, and Caleb and Walt were bringing in the last 2 with the methodical efficiency of men who had been given clear instructions and had followed them. Gideon surveyed the situation. He looked at Lydia. "Theodore?" he said, because Theodore was the one usually tasked with this kind of coordination. "I couldn't wait for Theodore," she said. He looked at the patched fence. He looked at the returned cattle. He looked at Caleb, who had the expression of someone who had recently revised an opinion and was not entirely sure how to carry the revision. "How'd she do?" Gideon asked him. Caleb considered this with the brief seriousness of a young man being asked something that actually mattered to him. "Better than Sutter," he said. Sutter, who was within earshot, made a sound of profound offense. But even Sutter, Lydia noted, did not dispute it. The trouble from town, when it escalated, came in a form she hadn't anticipated. She had expected more visits from Aldrich and Pierce. She had expected continued pressure on Gideon's business relationships. She had expected, on some level, that Delacroix would do something, though she hadn't known what, once the territorial inquiry reached him. What she hadn't expected was Ruth Varney. Ruth Varney was the wife of one of Blackstone's most established ranchers, a woman of 50-something who had the manner of someone accustomed to her opinions carrying weight and no particular reason to question this. She arrived at the Hale Ranch on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, in a good buggy with a dark green trim, and asked at the door for Miss Rowan. Lydia came to the door and looked at her. Ruth Varney looked back with an expression that was not unkind exactly, but was the expression of someone who had appointed herself to a task she considered unpleasant, but necessary. "Miss Rowan," she said, "I wonder if you'd speak with me a moment." "I'm in the middle of the morning bread," Lydia said. "It won't take long." Lydia stepped out onto the porch rather than inviting her in. She understood this visit well enough to know that the kitchen table was not where she wanted to have it. "Mrs. Varney," she said, "what can I do for you?" Ruth Varney gathered herself in the particular way of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was now recalibrating because the circumstances were slightly different than anticipated. "I want you to know that I don't share Martin Delacroix's opinion of you," she began. "That's a kind starting place," Lydia said. "But I'm concerned," Ruth continued, "about what your continued presence here is costing Gideon Hale. He's a man this community values. He has been through—" She paused, and the pause meant the dead wife. "A great deal. And I worry that his loyalty to you, which I believe is genuine, please understand I believe it's genuine, may be costing him more than he's telling anyone." "Did he send you?" Lydia asked. "No," Ruth said with some emphasis. "Gideon Hale would never— No, I came on my own." "Then you're giving me information about a man's situation that he hasn't chosen to share with me himself," Lydia said. "Which means you're either trying to help me or trying to move me. I'd like to know which." Ruth Varney blinked. She had clearly prepared for more resistance and less precision. "I'm trying to be honest with you," she said after a moment. "Then be honest," Lydia said. "Tell me what's actually happening." A pause. "Callaway is moving to block the renewal on Gideon's grazing permit for the federal land on the east side," Ruth said. "It comes up in December. He has 3 votes on the county board already. He needs 1 more. She looked at Lydia directly. "The condition being discussed, informally, is that Gideon resolve his current situation." His current situation, meaning her. Lydia stood on the porch and felt the cold of it. Not the weather cold, but the particular cold of being someone else's bargaining chip. "How long has this been in motion?" she said. 6 weeks, Ruth said. "Maybe 7. 6 or 7 weeks. The whole time she'd been organizing cattle retrievals and writing letters to land attorneys and telling herself she was building something. "Why are you telling me this?" Lydia asked. "Honestly." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I think you deserve to know the truth. And because—" She stopped, and something in her expression shifted from the prepared manner into something more genuine. "Because I remember what it was like to be a woman in this territory, with someone else deciding what my situation cost." Lydia looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "You could go to Millfield," Ruth said. "There's more work there, more opportunity." "I know there is," Lydia said. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Varney." She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment with her hands braced on the counter, looking at the bread she'd been making, the dough that needed another 20 minutes before it was ready to shape. She shaped it anyway. Her hands knew what to do even when her mind was somewhere else. The grazing permit on the east side. December. 1 vote. She thought about Gideon riding to the county seat and coming back tired in a way that had nothing to do with the distance. She thought about the financial papers on his desk that he'd been recalculating. She thought about the gate latch that had needed fixing since spring and somehow kept getting deferred. She thought about the fact that he had not told her any of this. That evening, after supper, she waited until the last of the men had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet, and she went to the doorway of the study. Gideon was at the desk. "Ruth Varney came today," she said. He went very still. "She told me about the East grazing permit," she said, "and Callaway's 3 votes, and December." He set down what he was holding. He didn't look at her for a moment. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" she said. He looked up then. "When I had a better answer than I have right now." The honesty of it stopped her. She had prepared on the way from the kitchen to be angry, a clean, justified anger, the kind she understood how to carry. What she hadn't prepared for was the expression on his face, not evasive, not managing her, just tired. tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has gotten so used to the weight they've stopped noticing what it costs. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. Not because she'd planned to, because standing felt wrong. "How bad is it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The East permit covers 400 acres of grazing. Without it, I'd need to reduce the South herd by at least a third going into winter. The financials would be manageable. I've run tighter, like I said. But it would set us back 2-3 years. I could go," she said. Not because she wanted to, because she needed to put it on the table where they could both look at it. Gideon looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger, not the careful flatness she was used to, something rawer than either. "I told you," he said. "That's not a thing I undo." "You said that about hiring me," she said. "This is bigger than hiring." "It's the same principle," he said. "Gideon, I'm not going to send you away so Royce Calloway can feel like he won something," he said, and the steadiness in his voice had an edge to it now, not hot, but hard. "And I'm not going to send you away because some lawyer in a land office is slower than the problem. We sent the letter. Birch is moving. When the inquiry reaches Delacroix, this whole structure Calloway has built falls apart because it's built on Delacroix's version of events." "That could take months," she said. "Then it takes months," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "Why?" she said. "I need you to tell me why. Not the principle of it. Why you specifically won't let this go." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Because I've done the other thing," he said. "I've let things go because it was practical, because the cost was too high, because—" He stopped, and she could see him navigating something internal, some territory he didn't go to often. "Because there was always a reason that felt reasonable, and I know what the reasonable choice leaves you with in the end." He looked at the desk, then at her. "I'm not interested in reasonable choices anymore. I made this one with my eyes open, and I'm keeping it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up again, the same east wind that had been a cold whisper in October and was finding its real voice now. She could hear it against the windows. She thought about the woman in Mrs. Cobble's boarding house with $8 and a shrinking horizon, doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. She thought about the morning on the bank steps and Martin Delacroix's careful, sorrowful smile. She thought about 2 years of building something careful and small, and how quickly it had come apart. And she thought about a gate latch fixed without being asked, a letter carried without question, a man who had not looked away from a problem everyone else was waiting for him to solve by getting rid of it. "You should know," she said carefully, "that Birch's letter mentioned the 2 parcels with active purchase agreements. Someone's about to lose money on land they don't actually own. I've been thinking about it, and I believe if we could find out who those buyers are before the transaction completes, we could warn them." Gideon looked at her. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said. "I think it might be what moves the timeline." He nodded slowly, and she could see him working it. If a buyer goes to the land office themselves, if there's a financial victim actively involved, not just a historical irregularity, the inquiry becomes urgent, she said. He looked at her with a kind of attention she didn't know yet how to receive. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I think about most things for a while," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't much, but she was getting better at reading small quantities of expression on his face, and she thought it was as close to a genuine smile as she'd seen from him. "I'll write to Birch tomorrow," he said. "Ask him for the names on the purchase agreements." "I'll write it," she said. "You can add your note." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, and this time the nod contained the same quality as the earlier one about the gate, something that was more than a nod. She stood up to go back to the kitchen. At the doorway she paused, not because she'd planned to, but because there was one more thing that needed saying. "For what it's worth," she said, without turning around, "I don't think you're operating on principle alone." She felt, rather than saw, the stillness behind her. "No," he said, after a moment. "I'm not." She went back to the kitchen. She checked the bread she'd left to cool. She straightened things that didn't need straightening. Outside, the wind was coming harder now, and the temperature had dropped several degrees since afternoon. She could feel it in the draft around the window frames, the particular quality of cold that had come down from somewhere high and wasn't apologizing for itself. The first real storm was still weeks away. But that night, standing in Gideon Hale's kitchen, listening to the wind work itself up towards something, Lydia Rowan had the particular and not unpleasant feeling of someone who has decided to stop waiting for a storm and start preparing for it instead. Harlan Birch's response to the second letter came faster than the first, 12 days instead of 3 weeks, which told Lydia something about how seriously the man was now taking the matter. Theodore brought it back from Millfield on a Thursday, same as before. Same coat pocket, same wordless transfer to Gideon's hand. But this time Gideon brought it to the kitchen immediately, before he'd even poured coffee, which told her something too. The names on the purchase agreements were a couple named Edmund and Clara Forsyth, who had traveled from Ohio the previous spring and were in the process of buying a parcel of 160 acres on the southern edge of the territory. They had paid a deposit of $240. The final payment was due in 3 weeks. Lydia read this and set the letter down. $240 was not an abstract sum. $240 was what a working man saved over years. $240 was the kind of money that represented a decision a family didn't make twice. "Do you know them?" she asked. "I know of them," Gideon said. "Edmund Forsyth. He's been working the livery in Blackstone for the past 8 months, saving up. I've spoken to him twice, maybe 3 times. He seemed like a careful man. A careful man who trusted the land office," Lydia said. Yes. She thought about Edmund Forsyth, who she didn't know, carefully saving money toward land that someone had already sold. She thought about Clara Forsyth, who she also didn't know, and what a woman's face looked like when she understood that careful hadn't been enough. "We have to warn them," she said. "I know. Before the final payment." "I know, Lydia." She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she'd learned to associate with something he wanted to say and was deciding how. "Delacroix knows the Forsyths are close to completing the purchase," Gideon said. "Birch thinks he may accelerate the timeline to collect the final payment before the inquiry reaches him." "How long does Birch think we have?" "He doesn't know. Could be 2 weeks. Could be less." "Then someone needs to go to Blackstone," she said. "Talk to Edmund Forsyth directly. Not a letter. A letter can be intercepted, delayed, dismissed. Someone needs to put this in front of him in person." "Yes," Gideon said. "It can't be me," she said. "Not in Blackstone." "No." He paused. "It needs to be someone he'll listen to. Someone he has no reason to distrust." She thought about this. "Theodore," she said. "Theodore's not a man Edmund Forsyth knows." "Then you," she said. Gideon nodded slowly, but his expression was complicated. "If I go to Blackstone and seek out Forsyth, Delacroix will hear about it within the day. Calloway will hear about it within the hour. Whatever's being arranged on the permit—" "I know," Lydia said. She did know. She had been turning this problem over since she'd read the names in Birch's letter, and she kept arriving at the same narrow space between what needed to happen and what it would cost. "There's another way," she said. Gideon waited. "Ruth Varney," she said. "She came here to warn me. She's not in Calloway's orbit, or if she is, she's there with reservations. If she went to Clara Forsyth woman to woman before Edmund completes the payment—" Gideon considered this for a longer moment than she expected. "Ruth Varney is also the wife of a man who has to live in this town," he said. "I know that too," Lydia said, "which is why I can't ask her, but you can." Another pause. "You're asking me to involve another person in this," he said. "I'm asking you to consider whether she's already involved," Lydia said. "She came here on her own, Gideon. She didn't have to. She could have let things take their course and been comfortable. She chose not to." She looked at him steadily. "Some people do that." He met her gaze. The reference was not lost on him, and she hadn't intended it to be. "I'll ride to the Varney place tomorrow," he said. He left before dawn and came back in the late afternoon with the particular tiredness of a productive day rather than a difficult one. Lydia was at the stove when she heard the horse in the yard. She waited. He came in, hung his coat, poured coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table, which was unusual. He generally stood when he talked in the kitchen. Sitting meant something had shifted. "Ruth Varney will speak with Clara Forsyth," he said, "day after tomorrow." Lydia released a breath she'd been holding since morning. "How did she respond when you explained it?" "Differently than I expected," he said. I thought I'd need to persuade her. I didn't. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She knew. Not the specifics, not the documents or the claim numbers, but she'd had a feeling about Delacroix for a long time. She said he'd tried to sell her husband a parcel 3 years ago that she'd convinced Edmund to pass on. She couldn't say why exactly, just something in the way he talked about the documentation. She trusted her instinct, Lydia said. She did, he said, and her husband didn't entirely, so they bought different land and… He paused. It turned out to be better land anyway, which she mentioned with a tone that suggested this was a point she had not let him forget. Something lightened in Lydia's chest. Not quite laughter, but adjacent to it. Good for her, she said. She also said something else, Gideon said. He looked at the table. She said to tell you that she's sorry for the way she came here the first time. That she thought she was helping and she was actually just, her word, meddling. Lydia was quiet for a moment. She was being honest, she said. I can work with honest. Gideon looked up. There was something in his expression that she'd been seeing more of lately. Something less guarded than his default. Something that she hadn't tried to name because naming things too early had a way of making them retreat. The permit situation, he said. Calloway met with the 4th board member last week. His name is Abe Howell. He runs a small cattle operation north of town, and he's been in debt to Calloway's brother-in-law, that's Pierce, for about 4 years. So Calloway has his 4th vote, Lydia said. Not yet. Howell hasn't committed, but Pierce has started calling in the social debt, which is, it's enough pressure. December is 6 weeks away, she said. 5.5. She looked at him. He looked at her. There were things being said in that silence that neither of them had the right vocabulary for yet, or perhaps the right courage. The Forsyth situation has to move first, she said. Yes, he said. One thing at a time. Clara Forsyth went to the Territorial Land Office herself on a Friday, 4 days after Ruth Varney spoke with her. Lydia learned this not through any official channel, but through the particular way news traveled in frontier territory, which was to say, through Theodore, who had heard it from a man in Millfield who had been at the land office on unrelated business and witnessed a woman from Blackstone arriving with considerable determination and a folder of documents and asking to speak with the senior land administrator who was not available and then waiting 3 hours until he was. Theodore relayed this information to Gideon. Gideon relayed it to Lydia. Lydia stood in the kitchen and felt something shift in the large, slow machinery of consequences. She went herself, she said. Apparently Edmund wanted to go and she told him she would handle it, Theodore said, with the particular expression of a man who approved of this decision. What happened after she met with the administrator? Lydia asked. He doesn't know, Theodore said. She came out after 40 minutes, and she wasn't crying, and she looked… He paused, searching for the word, settled. Settled. Lydia understood settled. Settled was what happened when you'd been carrying something uncertain, and you'd finally put it down in a place where someone competent would deal with it. Then Birch will hear from the land office soon, Gideon said. If Mrs. Forsyth brought the purchase documents, they have everything they need to move, Lydia said. What she didn't say, what none of them said, was that Delacroix would also hear soon, that the quiet machinery of consequence worked in multiple directions at once, and that one of those directions led back to her Sam. The first snow came the following week. Not the blizzard, nothing that dramatic, not yet. Just the season's opening statement, 3 inches overnight, the world going white and still by morning, the kind of snow that was almost pretty before it became work. Lydia was up at 5 as always, the kitchen warm before anyone else was moving, watching the gray-white light come up over the snow-covered yard. She had been watching weather differently since coming to the ranch. In town, weather was a backdrop. Here it was a participant, and not always a cooperative one. She'd been watching the sky for a week with the feeling she'd picked up from the men. An atmospheric unease, a quality to the wind at night that the experienced hands treated with quiet seriousness. Sutter had said, the previous Friday, "Sky's got something in it." Caleb had said, "Just the regular cold." Sutter had looked at him with the patient contempt of 11 winters on this ranch. "You weren't here the winter of '79, he'd said, and left it at that. Lydia had been here for neither the regular cold nor 1879, but she'd been paying enough attention to know that when Sutter said a thing with that particular quiet, it was worth tracking. She had quietly begun an audit of the stores. She did it without announcing it, which she recognized was probably not the right approach. Gideon ran this operation and was not a man who liked discovering things were happening on his ranch without his knowledge. But she also knew that suggesting they might be understocked for a serious winter would be received better with evidence than with concern, so she gathered the evidence first. What she found was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable. The stores were calibrated for a normal winter, which was fine for a normal winter, but a serious one would run them down faster than the calculations accounted for. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, adequate. Lamp oil, thinner than she'd like. Medical supplies. She thought of this because of Caleb's arm, and because she'd been reading the sky the way Sutter read it, and her reading agreed with his. She put together a list and, that evening, set it on the desk in the study while Gideon was reviewing accounts. He looked at it without picking it up. "What is this?" "A stores assessment," she said, "for a harder winter than average." He looked at it more carefully now. She watched him work through the numbers. He was quick with figures, she'd noticed, quicker than most men who dealt mainly in cattle and land. "You've been doing this quietly," he said. "I wanted to have the numbers before I had the conversation," she said. He looked up at her. Yes. All right." He looked back at the list. "The lamp oil I knew about. I've been putting off the Millfield order." "I noticed." "The medical supplies." He paused at that line. "You think it'll be bad?" "I think Sutter thinks it'll be bad," she said, "and I've learned to follow Sutter's weather instincts even when I argue with everything else about him." The corner of Gideon's mouth moved. "That's wise," he said. "Theodore could take the order to Millfield on Thursday," she said, "if you authorize it." "I'll authorize it," he said, "and I'll add to it." He picked up a pen and wrote 3 lines at the bottom of her list. She looked at them. Additional rope, extra horseshoe iron, a second medical kit. "You think so too," she said. "I think Sutter's been right about weather longer than I've been running this ranch," he said. Theodore rode to Millfield on Thursday with an expanded supply order and came back Saturday with the wagon loaded. The men unloaded it with the efficient urgency of people who understood, without being told, that this was preparation for something. The letter from Harlan Birch arrived 9 days after Clara Forsythe's visit to the land office, faster than anything that had come before. This time it was addressed to Lydia directly, with a second enclosed letter addressed to Gideon. She read hers first, alone, at the kitchen table, on a Monday morning when the men were out and the house was quiet. Birch confirmed that the Territorial Land Office had opened a formal investigation following Clara Forsythe's complaint. He confirmed that Martin Delacroix had been formally notified and had been required to surrender his records pending the inquiry. He stated that the inquiry had already identified 9 fraudulent claims rather than the 7 he'd originally estimated, and that the Territorial Attorney General's office was reviewing whether criminal charges were appropriate. He said, in the last paragraph, that Lydia Rowan's original account had been foundational to everything that followed, and that her recollection of the specific claim numbers had been corroborated by what the investigators found in Delacroix's files. She folded the letter. She put it on the table. She went to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the yard, the bare trees along the fence line, the gray sky that had been threatening more snow for 3 days. She was not sure exactly what she felt. She had thought it would be cleaner than this, had thought there would be a clear moment of relief or vindication or something that could be labeled and set down. What she felt instead was a complicated mixture of things, some of which she didn't have immediate names for, and underneath all of it, a tiredness she hadn't let herself feel until now, because there hadn't been room for it. She had been right about the documents. She had always known she was right about the documents. But being right about a thing, she had learned, was not the same as being vindicated for it, and vindication, when it came, did not necessarily undo the damage done in the interval. She heard the kitchen door and turned around. Gideon came in from the morning check of the North herd. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She picked up the letter and held it out to him. He read it standing up, still in his coat. She watched him read it, watched the progress of it across his expression. He looked up. 9 claims, he said. 9, she said. And the Attorney General? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He's finished, he said, not triumphantly, just as a fact. Yes, she said. Another silence. Lydia, he said. Something in his voice had a different quality. Don't, she said, before she knew she was going to say it. He stopped. Don't say it was worth it, she said, or that it worked out. Not yet. There are still people in that town who believe what he said about me, and the investigation doesn't automatically. She stopped. She was not by nature a woman who lost her composure in front of other people, and she was not losing it now precisely, but there was something in the careful control of it that cost her something visible. Gideon didn't say anything about that. I know, he said. I wasn't going to say that. What were you going to say? He considered. I was going to say thank you, he said, for doing what you did when it would have been easier and smarter not to, and for doing it without, he paused, without making it something I was obligated to respond to. She looked at him. Most people, he said, with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain, when they do something significant, want it acknowledged in a particular way. He stopped again. You just did it. She didn't know what to say to this. She looked at the window, at the gray sky. I'm going to write to my sister in Kansas City, she said, which was not at all what she'd intended to say. Gideon blinked, recalibrating. All right, he said. I haven't written to her in 4 months, she said, since before Delacroix. I didn't want to. She stopped. I didn't know what to say. About where I was. Whether it was. The word she wanted was safe, but she didn't use it. Stable. Is it stable? He asked, quietly. She looked at him. More than it was, she said. He nodded. One of his particular nods. What? 2 days after Birch's letter, with the investigation now a formal and moving thing, and Delacroix's records confiscated, and his public standing in a state of rapid deterioration, the structure that Royce Calloway had built began to show its cracks. Calloway's power in Blackstone had always been partly financial and partly social, and the social part was disproportionately dependent on Martin Delacroix's respectability. Delacroix had been the mechanism by which people were sorted, in Calloway's world. The man who could make a sale happen, or not happen, who could file a claim or raise a question about one. With Delacroix suddenly under territorial investigation, 2 of the businesses that had been slowly suffocating Gideon's supply arrangements discovered, with impressive speed, that they could fill orders on their regular timeline after all. The 4th board vote, Abe Howell, reached out to Gideon through an intermediary with what amounted to an apology and a statement of recusal from the permit decision. Gideon told Lydia about this in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening, with the understatement of a man who had learned not to celebrate until things were actually done. Howell's out, he said. Calloway can't block the permit renewal without him, she said. No. She thought about this. He'll find another angle, she said. Probably, Gideon agreed. But the Delacroix situation changes what angles are available to him. He was using Delacroix's story as the foundation. Without it, he's just a man who doesn't like you, she said. Men who just don't like me, Gideon said. I know how to handle. This was, she thought, probably true. The blizzard came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the first snow. It did not arrive like a regular storm. It arrived the way Sutter had predicted it would arrive, with intention, in the manner of something that had been building for a long time and had finally gotten around to doing what it had always been planning to do. The warning signs were there on Wednesday. A particular heaviness to the air, the cattle pressing toward the fence lines in the nervous way they had before serious weather, and Sutter walking through the yard in the early afternoon with an expression that Lydia, watching from the kitchen window, recognized as a man who had been right about something and wished he wasn't. She spent Wednesday afternoon in a kind of focused preparation she didn't announce. She moved the supply of lamp oil to the kitchen where it was accessible. She checked the medical kit she'd organized when the Millfield order came back. She calculated what the kitchen stove could maintain and for how long, and rearranged the split wood stacked inside to maximize what they had. At supper Wednesday night, Gideon looked around the table at his men and then at Lydia and said, "Tomorrow's going to be serious. I need everyone to know their stations before dawn." The conversation that followed was practical and fast. Gideon assigned positions, who was watching which herd, who was handling the east fence, who was staying close to the main buildings. Theodore was given the north approach. Caleb and Walt were paired for the south pasture. When the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Gideon remained at the table. "You know what I'm going to ask you," he said. "You're going to tell me to stay in the house," she said. "Yes, and I'm going to tell you that the house requires managing in a serious storm the same as everything else does," she said, "and that if someone comes back hurt, you need someone here who knows where everything is." He looked at her for a moment. "Stay in the house," he said. "I will," she said, "unless I need to." He started to say something else and stopped. "Get some sleep," she said. "You'll need to be out before light." The storm hit at 4 in the morning with a sound like something structural failing. Lydia was already awake, had been awake for an hour, lying in the dark listening to the wind pick up the way it does before a serious storm drops fully on you. When it arrived, it did not arrive tentatively. She was dressed and in the kitchen before 5. She built the fire up past what she'd normally allow and kept it there. She put water on. She moved through the house checking the window seals, noting where cold was getting in, stuffing rags into the gaps under the doors. The men went out in the dark, and the howl of it, shapes disappearing into the white, and she stood on the porch for 30 seconds watching them go before the cold drove her back inside. For the first 2 hours, she managed the house and kept track of time and didn't let herself think about what was happening out there. She made food and kept it warm. She maintained the fire. She sorted the medical supplies for the 3rd time because sorting them gave her hands something to do. At 7, Caleb came in half blind from snow, with Walt behind him, to report that the south fence on the lower field had failed completely and the cattle were loose in the draw. He was clear-eyed and specific despite the cold in his face, and she sent him back out with a proper account of how many men were available and which direction the draw ran, because she had learned the geography of this ranch over 3 months, and she knew the draw better than Caleb apparently did. At 9, 2 men she didn't see clearly came through the east door, and one of them was Sutter, helping the other, and the other had a cut on his forehead from a fence post that had come loose in the wind. She dealt with the cut efficiently and sent Sutter back out. He was fine, just cold, and kept the second man, whose name was Peters, at the kitchen table where she could watch the cut. At 10:30, Theodore came in alone, which was wrong, because Theodore should have been with the North Approach group. "Where's Gideon?" she said. She could hear something in her own voice that she didn't try to manage. Theodore's expression answered her before his words did. "He went out after the North herd," Theodore said. "When the fence went, I was 20 yards behind him and the snow came down and I lost him. I've been—" He stopped. Theodore was a man who did not easily show distress. What she saw on his face was distress. "I've been looking for half an hour." The kitchen was very still for a moment. "Where was the north fence when you last saw him?" she said. Theodore told her. She had her coat and her boots before he finished the sentence. "You're not going out there," he said. "Someone has to go in the right direction," she said. "You went looking without a reference point. I know where the north fence line runs from the ridge down to the creek." She looked at him. "Tell me the exact spot you last saw him." He told her. "The creek bends east there," she said. "If he followed the cattle, he'd have gone east. If he lost his bearing in the snow, he'd go downhill. Downhill from there is the hollow behind the old cottonwood." Theodore stared at her. "I've walked that fence 3 times in the past month," she said. "I told you the east gate needed fixing, and I'd walked out to see it myself." "You shouldn't have been walking that far from the house," Theodore said, which was both accurate and entirely beside the point. "I know," she said. "Get your coat." They found him in the hollow behind the cottonwood. He had made it that far, and then his horse had refused the hollow. The horse was smarter, in this particular instance, than the direction the cattle had gone, and the horse was what she spotted first, standing with its head down at the edge of the cottonwood's reach, patient in the way of horses that have given up arguing with their riders. Gideon was on the ground, not unconscious, but not standing. The cold had gotten into him badly. He'd been in the wind for 2 hours in conditions that took the heat out of a person faster than they could regenerate it, and he had the shaking and the confused deliberateness of someone whose body had been working too hard at too many things at once. Theodore got him up. Lydia got to the other side, and they moved him back toward the house with the particular labor of moving a large, semi-cooperative man through deep snow in a storm. He tried to tell her, at one point, that he was fine. "You're not," she said. The North herd can wait 10 minutes, she said. "You cannot." He didn't argue after that, which told her the cold had gotten further into him than he would have admitted if he were warmer. The kitchen was very warm when they got him in. She sat him near the stove. She stripped his outer coat and got a dry blanket around him and began the process of reversing what the cold had done with the focused efficiency of someone who was not going to spend any of her available energy on fear until the emergency was resolved. Peters, who was still at the table with his bandaged forehead, watched this without comment and had the sense not to say anything useful or useless. "Water," she said to Peters, and he got up and got it. She checked Gideon's hands and feet, the extremities, which was where serious cold damage settled, and found them cold and clumsy but responsive. She checked his face for the white patches of deeper cold damage and found none. She made him drink warm water and then broth when she had it heated, and she kept talking to him. Not reassuring talk, practical talk, the names of the things she was doing and why, because talking kept him tracking, and tracking was what she needed from him. After 20 minutes, he was shaking less and his eyes were clearer. "How many of the North heard?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Theodore went back out with Caleb. We'll know when they come in." "If we lost the North—" "Gideon," she said, "you can't fix the North herd from this chair. You can make it worse by going back out before you're steady." He looked at her. He had the expression of a man whose judgment he was not entirely trusting, which meant, she thought, that his judgment was actually returning. "You came out to find me," he said. "Theodore came out to find you," she said. "I came out to send him in the right direction." "Lydia, drink the rest of that," she said. He drank the rest of it. He was quiet for a moment, and she was quiet too, and the kitchen was full of the sound of the storm outside and the fire inside, those two sounds competing with each other in a way that felt almost like a conversation. "The hollow behind the cottonwood," he said. "You'd have found your way back," she said, "but you needed more time than you had." "How did you know?" "I told Theodore I'd walked the north fence 3 times, she said. "I've actually walked it 6. I wanted to know the land." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not the almost smile, not the revised assessment look, something newer and less guarded than anything she'd seen from him. Something that had the quality of a door opened rather than a door almost opened. "Why?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Because it's worth knowing," she said. It was not a complete answer and they both knew it, but the storm was still going and Peters was still at the table, and Theodore would be back soon with news about the North herd that would determine a great deal about the next several weeks. And there would be time, or there wouldn't be, but she had stopped preparing for the version where there wasn't. Theodore came back at noon. They had lost 11 cattle from the North herd. 43 had been recovered. The fence was down in 2 places and would need real repair, not a temporary patch. One of the hands, a man named Briggs, had a badly sprained ankle from a fall in the draw. 2 more were cold enough to need the kitchen warmth and the blankets she had ready. Gideon received this information sitting up, with color coming back into his face. She watched him do the math: cattle lost, fence repair costs, the already thin margins. And she watched his jaw set in the particular way of a man absorbing a blow he'd prepared for, but that still landed hard. 43, he said. Yes, Theodore said. Could have been worse. Could have, Theodore said. He looked briefly at Lydia. Gideon did not follow the look. He was looking at the table. Lydia got up to check on Briggs's ankle because it needed checking and because Gideon needed a minute with the numbers that she wasn't going to interrupt. She was wrapping Briggs's ankle at the kitchen table when she heard Gideon get up from his chair. She heard him cross to the window. She heard him stand there for a moment in the particular silence of a man looking at damage he's calculating how to repair. She did not look up from Briggs's ankle. The south fence, Gideon said, to no one specific. How bad? Down along a 30-foot section, Caleb said from the doorway. We can get to it when the storm breaks. Tomorrow, if it breaks by morning, Gideon said. Yes, sir. Tell the others they did well, he said. All of them. Caleb looked at Lydia briefly, with the expression of someone noting something he intended to retain. Then he nodded and went back out. The storm continued through the afternoon and eased by evening, leaving behind the particular quiet of a world under new snow, a quiet that had weight to it, the weight of all the sound that wasn't happening anymore. By nightfall, the kitchen had settled into something that wasn't quite normal but was moving in that direction. Men fed, injuries addressed, the immediate crisis passed. Gideon was at the table with his account book, doing what he always did with hard news, which was turn it into numbers and find out exactly what the numbers required. She cleaned the kitchen and did not hover and did not ask, because she had learned that this was one of the things he needed to do alone, and that offering to help would not be received as help. She was banking the fire for the night when he said, without looking up, "The financial damage is manageable, barely, but manageable." "I know," she said. He looked up. "You've seen the accounts," he said. It was not an accusation. "I saw the pages on your desk the night I brought you your plate," she said. "I didn't look on purpose. I couldn't help reading the numbers." He was quiet. "They're tight," she said. "But the Millfield order was mostly paid for separately. The fence repair is labor mostly. The cattle we lost—" She paused, because this was where it got harder. 11 animals from a herd that size, going into winter, with the stores we have. It's survivable." "Survivable," he said. "That's not nothing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the night was clear and very cold, and somewhere out there the snow was settling into the shapes the storm had made it. "No," he said, "it's not nothing." She finished banking the fire. She said goodnight. She climbed the stairs to her room, which had its own lock, which she used. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed a storm, and thought about a man in a hollow behind a cottonwood tree who hadn't been able to get up on his own, and the particular expression on his face when she'd told him she'd walked the north fence 6 times because it was worth knowing. She thought about what worth knowing meant, and all the things it might apply to, and she was still thinking about it when she finally fell asleep. The days after the blizzard had the particular quality of aftermath, not peaceful, exactly, but quieter than what had come before, with the kind of stillness that follows something large and violent and spent. The fences got repaired. The remaining cattle were counted and redistributed between pastures. Briggs's ankle kept him off his feet for a week, which made him difficult in the specific way of a man unaccustomed to stillness. And Lydia dealt with this by giving him tasks he could do seated, which he received with poor grace and then did competently, because it turned out Briggs was genuinely useful with leatherwork, and had been wasting this skill on fence posts for 11 years. Gideon recovered from the cold without lasting damage, which she noted with a relief she kept to herself. He was back to full capacity within 2 days, which was faster than she thought wise and exactly what she'd expected. He did not mention the hollow behind the cottonwood again, and neither did she. But something had shifted in the space between them in a way that both of them were navigating carefully, and neither of them was naming. The investigation into Martin Delacroix moved forward in the slow, grinding way of official processes, not fast enough to be satisfying, fast enough to be real. Harlan Birch sent a brief letter in the first week of December, confirming that Delacroix had been required to appear before the Territorial Land Administrator, and that his ability to conduct any land transactions had been suspended pending the inquiry's completion. The letter also noted, in Birch's compressed legal prose, that 3 additional fraudulent claims had been identified beyond the 9 already documented, bringing the total to 12. 12. The number sat with Lydia in a particular way. Not because it was her victory. It wasn't. Not cleanly, not in any way she could hold without also holding the 2 years she'd spent in Blackstone building something that Martin Delacroix had chosen to destroy, but because it was the shape of the thing he'd actually done. 12 families or individuals or couples like the Forsyths who had trusted the process, who had done everything right. She thought about this more than was useful. Ruth Varney came to the ranch again in the second week of December, this time with a basket of preserved plums and the demeanor of someone who had decided to do a thing properly that she'd done improperly before. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked with a directness that Lydia found unexpectedly comfortable. "People are saying different things now," Ruth said. "About you, about Delacroix." "I imagine they are," Lydia said. "Some of them are saying they knew something was wrong with him all along," Ruth said, with a dry precision that suggested her opinion of this particular revisionism. "People usually did know," Lydia said. "They just needed someone else to say it first." Ruth looked at her. "You're not angry about that?" Lydia considered this honestly. "I'm tired," she said. "Angry is something I can revisit when I'm less tired." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Royce Calloway held a dinner at his house last week," she said. "My husband was invited." I was not, which is how those things work. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. I'm told the mood was considerably less assured than it was a month ago. The permit renewal came through, Lydia said. It had, quietly, without ceremony, the third week of November, with Abe Howell recused and Calloway short of his blocking vote. I heard, Ruth said. I was glad of it. Were you? I told you, Ruth said with a slight sharpening. I came here on my own. I've made my position clear to anyone who's asked, which admittedly has not been many people, because my position is not the comfortable one in the current climate. She paused. My husband is not a bad man. He's a cautious one. There's a difference, though it gets inconvenient at times. Lydia looked at her. Ruth Varney was a woman who had spent many years being the right kind of person in the right kind of setting, and who had, somewhere along the way, developed a private opinion about whether that was sufficient. This private opinion had driven her to this kitchen twice, and it showed in the set of her face, not unhappy exactly, but slightly unreconciled. Thank you, Lydia said, for what you did with Clara Forsyth. It needed doing, Ruth said. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity. They sat in a comfortable quiet for a moment, the kind that doesn't need filling. There are going to be apologies, Ruth said eventually. Public ones. People who were cold to you in town or actively unkind. They'll come when it's safe to come, when Delacroix is fully finished and there's nothing to lose by admitting they were wrong. I know, Lydia said. How will you receive them? Lydia thought about it. Politely, she said, and without making it easier than it should be. Ruth's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Good, she said. The thing Lydia had been carrying without fully examining chose the third week of December to make itself impossible to ignore any longer. It had been building for a while. She could see that clearly enough in retrospect. The night she'd told Gideon she needed him to tell her why. The hollow behind the cottonwood. The particular quality of his attention when she said a thing that mattered. The way his eyes stayed with her a beat longer than necessary. The fact that he had started, very subtly, finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in. She recognized all of this. She had not, until the third week of December, let herself decide what to do with it. What precipitated the decision was not dramatic. It was Tuesday afternoon, the kind of cold, clear day that came after the first serious snow. And she was in the study because the study's lamp had been burning poorly, and she'd identified it as a wick problem and had come to fix it while Gideon was out with the South herd. She was adjusting the wick when she noticed, on the desk next to the account book, a framed photograph she hadn't seen there before. Or perhaps she had seen it and not registered it until now. It was a portrait, a woman, younger than Lydia was currently, with a direct gaze and a slight forward tilt to her posture, as though she'd been leaning toward something at the moment the photograph was taken. Gideon's wife. Lydia looked at her for a moment. She did not have a name. Gideon had never said it in her presence, and she had never asked, because it had seemed like a room she wasn't entitled to enter without invitation. But here was the face, and it was a good face, the kind that suggested character rather than simply pleasantness. And she had clearly been a woman who did not lean away from things. Lydia fixed the lamp wick. She left the study without moving the photograph. That evening, after supper, Gideon remained at the table after the others had gone. This happened occasionally now, without either of them having made a formal arrangement of it. The kitchen in the evening, the last of the fire, the particular kind of talk that happened when the day was done and there was no one else present. Lydia washed the last of the dishes. She heard him behind her, not talking, not reading, just present. I saw the photograph on your desk, she said, without turning around. Silence. I wasn't prying, she said. I was fixing the lamp. I know, he said. I don't know her name, she said. I realized I've been here 4 months and I've never known it. A pause. Eleanor, he said. She finished the dish she was washing. She set it on the drying rack. She looks like someone who didn't take much for granted, Lydia said. Another pause, longer this time. No, Gideon said. She didn't. His voice had a different quality. Not closed, not raw, something between them. She was very clear about what she wanted and what she thought. You'd have found her difficult, I think. Lydia turned around. He was looking at the table. Because she was direct? Lydia said. Because she had standards, he said. and she'd have applied them to me regardless of what I thought about that. Sounds familiar? Lydia said. He looked up. Something in his face was more open than she'd seen it. Not performed openness, not the careful management he applied to most expressions, but the real kind, the kind that happens when a person is too tired of a particular weight to keep carrying it alone. I put the photograph out last week, he said. It's been in the drawer for 2 years. She didn't say anything. She waited. I don't know why I'm telling you this, he said. I think you do, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the night was very clear and very cold, the kind of cold that made the stars look close. I don't want you to leave, he said. It came out plainly, without the careful framing she'd come to expect from him, just the plain fact of it, sitting on the table between them. I haven't said I was leaving, she said. You haven't said you were staying, he said. She looked at him. This was true. She had been, for 4 months, existing in a condition that was present tense and functional and deliberately not projected forward, because projecting forward had taught her lessons she hadn't finished digesting. There are things you don't know about me, she said. I imagine there are, he said. There are things you don't know about me. Gideon, I'm not asking for a complete accounting, he said. I know what I've seen. I know what you've done in this house and on this ranch. And I know... He stopped, started again. I know what it meant that you walked the north fence 6 times. I know what that is. I'm not confused about what that is. She was quiet for a moment. I made a mistake, she said. In Blackstone, before Delacroix. Before I came to this town. A serious one. She said it directly, because the only way she knew how to say a thing this important was directly. I trusted someone I shouldn't have trusted, and I made choices I shouldn't have made, and people were hurt by it. Not the way Delacroix hurt people, not deliberately, not for money, but hurt. She looked at the table, then back at him. I left where I was because staying would have meant living inside what I'd done every day, and I couldn't. He was quiet. I came to Blackstone thinking I could start over, she said. And I suppose I did, only not the way I planned. What was the mistake, Hugh? He said. Not prying, asking. She thought about how to say it. I believe someone loved me who was using me, she said. And in the process of believing it, I helped him deceive people who deserved better. I didn't know what he was doing, not fully, but I should have asked questions I didn't ask. I chose not to ask them. She paused. When I found out, I told what I knew to the people who needed to know it. It didn't fix what had happened. It just meant I'd told the truth eventually, which I didn't think was enough. It's something, he said. Yes, she said. It's something. He was looking at her with the full direct attention he brought to things he was deciding about seriously. You're telling me this because you think it changes things, he said. I'm telling you because you should know, she said. Before anything, you should know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, does it change what you did in this house for 4 months? What you did for the Forsyths? What you did in that hollow? No, she said. Then it doesn't change things, he said. Gideon, it's not that simple. I know it's not simple, he said, and for the first time she heard something close to frustration in his voice, but not at her, at the inadequacy of his own words for what he was trying to say. I know the world is more complicated than one thing canceling another. I'm not saying your past doesn't exist. I'm saying I've been sitting in this kitchen for 4 months watching you live, and what I see is not a woman defined by a mistake she made before I knew her. Lydia was very still. I've made mistakes that cost people too, he said. Eleanor, he stopped, started again. There were years when I was so focused on this ranch that I missed things I shouldn't have missed. She never said so. She was too careful about my confidence. And when she was gone, I spent a long time knowing that I had not been entirely what she deserved, and nobody could tell me otherwise because they hadn't been there. He looked at the table. I'm not telling you that to make us equivalent. I'm telling you so you understand that I'm not judging from a position of having nothing to judge myself for. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the clear, cold night was silent. What are you asking me? She said. He looked up. I'm asking if you'll stay, he said. Not as the housekeeper, as... He paused, and she could see him deciding to say the thing plainly instead of managing it as mine. If that's something you'd consider. The word mine was not possessive in the way it might have been from another man. It was mutual in the way he said it. It contained the same weight in both directions. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about this boarding house room and the $8 and the arithmetic she'd already known the answer to. She thought about Mrs. Cobble's careful neutrality and the bank steps in October sunshine and Martin Delacroix's considered, deliberate smile. She thought about the gate latch fixed without being asked. The letter carried without question. A man who had said, "I hired you," and meant it as a covenant rather than a transaction. She thought about Eleanor in the photograph, leaning forward toward something, and wondered what she would make of a woman who had also refused, in the end, to lean away. "Yes," she said. "I'll consider it." His expression shifted. Not relief, exactly, but something that had been held very carefully, loosening slightly in the specific way of something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. "That's not a yes," he said. "No," she said. "It's more than a maybe." What happened in Blackstone over the following weeks was not swift, but it was thorough. Martin Delacroix's formal charges were filed the week before Christmas, by which time the Territorial Attorney General's office had taken full control of the inquiry and the number of fraudulent claims had settled at 14. The charges included filing false instruments, collecting payment for land he had no right to sell, and a third charge involving the falsification of survey records that carried the most serious legal weight. The news moved through Blackstone in the way that significant news moved through small towns, fast, absorbed into the community's self-understanding with a speed that was almost aggressive, as though the town was trying to get ahead of its own embarrassment. People who had accepted Delacroix's story about Lydia's theft began constructing, individually and collectively, a revised account of events in which their doubt had always been present, their skepticism always quietly maintained. Gideon rode to Blackstone for supplies on a Thursday in late December. He came back with a particular expression and a story. "Aldrich stopped me outside the feed store," he said. Lydia looked up from the bread she was shaping. "Fen Aldrich," she said. "The same. He wanted me to know that he'd never personally believed Delacroix's account, and that he regretted the inconvenience that the situation had caused, and that he hoped—" Gideon paused, clearly reconstructing, "that the episode hadn't soured my relationship with the business community, given that I was such a valued member of the local ranching network." "Valued member of the local ranching network," Lydia repeated. "He actually said that." "What did you say to him?" Gideon considered. "I told him I appreciated the sentiment and that my relationship with the business community would continue on the basis of how people conducted themselves going forward." "That's diplomatic," she said. "I'm capable of diplomatic," he said. "I know," she said. "I've just rarely seen it from you." The corner of his mouth moved. She returned to the bread. "Did anyone ask about me?" "3 people," he said. "Calloway's wife, who is apparently embarrassed by her husband and handling it by being excessively warm to anyone associated with me. The woman from the seamstress shop on 3rd, who wanted to know if you might be interested in taking work again." "And the third?" she said. "Edmund Forsyth," Gideon said. "He was at the feed store with a boy of about 10 who I assume is his son. He knew who I was, and he came over and he—" Gideon paused. "He had difficulty saying what he wanted to say, I think, but what came out was that he wanted to thank whoever had warned his wife in time." Lydia's hand stilled on the bread. "I told him it had been a collaborative effort," Gideon said, "and that I'd pass along his gratitude." She said nothing for a moment. She kept her hands moving. $240, she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what they nearly lost." "They didn't lose it," he said. Not consoling, just accurate. "No," she said. "They didn't." The town council met in the first week of January to discuss what to do about the land office, which would need to be staffed and administered by someone other than Delacroix for the foreseeable future. This was a practical problem. The land office served a genuine function and could not simply remain closed, and it had the effect of forcing the council into a conversation about competence rather than comfort, which was a shift from their recent operations. Theodore, who had sources of information that Lydia had never fully traced but had learned to trust, reported that Calloway's influence on the council had diminished substantially since the permit vote. and that two of the three men who had previously been in his orbit were repositioning themselves with the political instinct of weather vanes in a changing wind. "He's not finished," Gideon said. "Calloway doesn't finish." "No," Theodore agreed, "but he's recalculating." "As long as he's recalculating," Lydia said, "he's not acting." Both men looked at her. "That's a temporary condition," she said, "but temporary is worth something." It was worth, as it turned out, enough time for the territorial inquiry to complete its formal findings, which arrived in the second week of January in a document that Harlan Birch sent directly to Gideon because Lydia's name now appeared as a formal material witness in the inquiry record. The findings confirmed all 14 fraudulent claims. They confirmed that the fraud had been ongoing for at least 6 years. They confirmed that Martin Delacroix would face criminal proceedings in the spring. And they included one paragraph, formal, precise, stripped of any editorial quality, that stated that the inquiry had been initiated following information provided by a former employee of the Land Office whose account had proven accurate in every verifiable detail. She read this paragraph 3 times. Former employee, whose account had proven accurate in every verifiable detail. She folded the document carefully and put it in her trunk, on top of the piece of paper where she'd written down the claim numbers from memory on her first night in this house, back when all she'd had was a memory and a decision to do something with it. She told Gideon the rest of it on a Sunday evening in January, when the ranch was quiet and the men were in the bunkhouse and the kitchen was warm. She had been thinking about it since the night she'd told him the first part, the broad shape of it, the mistake, and its consequences. She had not told him the specific shape, the particular people, the way it had actually gone. She had told herself this was because the moment hadn't been right, but she was honest enough with herself eventually to know that the moment not being right was a story she told herself when she was afraid. She was still afraid. She told him anyway. The man in Kansas City had been a business partner of her employer, a charming, well-dressed man named Carruthers, who had presented himself as a legitimate investor and turned out to be running a scheme that redirected funds from a charitable account into his own operations. Lydia had been her employer's private secretary. She had copied the letters. She had organized the accounts. She had noticed, over time, that certain transactions didn't reconcile, and she had told herself it was bookkeeping error, and then told herself she didn't understand enough to be certain, and then eventually admitted to herself that she understood exactly enough and was choosing not to look directly at it because Carruthers had been kind to her in a way that she had allowed to matter too much. When she finally went to her employer with what she knew, 4 families had already transferred substantial sums. 2 of them had been partially reimbursed from the recovered funds. 2 had not. "I thought about those 2 families for a long time," she said. "I still do." Gideon was quiet. "I told myself the delay was because I wasn't certain," she said. "That was partly true. But it was also because I didn't want to look at what it meant about my own judgment, about how badly I'd wanted to believe in him." She looked at her hands. "Women who want to believe in people are not generally given much credit for the wanting. They're just blamed for the believing." "Yes," Gideon said, without qualification. "I'm not telling you this as an excuse," she said. "I'm telling you because you said I should know things about you before anything, and that seems fair to apply in the other direction." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does Carruthers know where you are?" The question surprised her. Practical, immediate, aimed at what mattered rather than at the narrative of it. "No," she said. "I left Kansas City and came here by way of 3 different stops. I don't think he would look. I was a witness, not a target." "All right," Gideon said. "That's it?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You noticed something was wrong," he said. "You took too long. You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. People were hurt, and some of them got restitution and some didn't, and you've carried the ones who didn't." "That's a generous summary," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. He paused. "It sounds like something I'd expect you to have done." She looked at him. "Not the delay," he said quickly. All of it. The noticing. The eventual telling." He struggled with it for a moment visibly. "You're not a perfect person. Neither was Eleanor, neither am I. I'm not looking for perfect." "What are you looking for?" she said. He met her eyes directly, with the particular honesty she had come to associate with him at his least managed, when he was saying something he'd decided to say, instead of something he'd prepared to say. "Someone who stays," he said, who doesn't leave when things get hard, or when it's convenient, or because the cost looks too high. Someone who walks the north fence because it's worth knowing. He paused. I've been watching you stay for 4 months. I know what that means. The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about the morning she'd first come here, the $12 and the diminishing horizon and Mrs. Coble's carefully neutral face. She thought about how far she had walked, in all directions, from that morning. I should tell you, she said, that I'm not easy to live with. I know, he said. I have opinions about how things should be done. I've noticed, he said, and I won't stop having them because, Lydia, he said. She stopped. I know, he said, and the simplicity of it, just those 2 words, carrying everything he'd observed and everything he'd decided and everything he apparently thought that was worth, made something in her chest move in the way it had moved when Caleb said she was all right, only considerably more so. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me properly, she said. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, not quite, but a quick recalibration, a man adjusting to a situation moving faster than he'd expected. He stood up from the table. He was, she thought, a man who understood that there were moments that required the full version of the thing, not the economical one. Lydia Rowan, he said, standing in his own kitchen with his hat already off and his hands not entirely sure what to do with themselves, which she found, unexpectedly, more reassuring than any amount of polished certainty would have been. Will you marry me? She had known it was coming. She had asked for it to come. She was still not entirely prepared for the simplicity of it when it arrived. No speech, no elaborate approach, just the plain question from a plain man asking plainly. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. It was, she thought, a breath that had been held for considerably longer than this evening. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. Outside, the January night was deep and cold and full of stars, and the ranch was quiet. In the way it only got when the weather was clear, and the animals were settled and nothing was immediately wrong with anything, which was not the ranch's most common condition, but occurred often enough to remind you what the work was for. She poured them both coffee they didn't particularly need. He sat back down. She sat across from him. They did not talk about plans that evening, about announcements or timing or what the town would say, because the town would say something. It always did. That conversation would come. Tonight they simply sat in the kitchen that she had made into a place that worked, in the house that he had kept going by force of will for 2 years, and drank their coffee, and existed in the new and slightly astonishing fact of what they had just agreed to. At some point she asked him whether he wanted more coffee. He said yes. She got up and poured it. She set the pot back on the stove. It was, she thought, a remarkably ordinary moment for something that felt the way it felt. But ordinary was, she had come to understand, not the opposite of significant. It was often what significant looked like when it wasn't trying to prove anything. They told the men at breakfast the following Monday. Gideon said it plainly, the way he said most things, that he and Miss Rowan were to be married, that the wedding would be quiet and soon, and that anyone who had a problem with this arrangement was welcome to take that problem somewhere else at their earliest convenience. He said this last part without particular heat, as a statement of available options rather than a threat, which somehow made it more final than a threat would have been. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Caleb said, "About time," with the confidence of someone reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion, and the table erupted into the particular noise of 12 men expressing approval through the only channels frontiermen generally had available, which is to say, loudly, with considerable table slapping, and at least 2 of them making comments that caused Lydia to give them a look that silenced them immediately. Theodore said nothing. He looked at Lydia across the table with the expression of a man who had seen something developing for a long time and was satisfied that the development had concluded correctly. She gave him a small nod. He gave her one back. That was the entire conversation, and it was sufficient. Sutter, predictably, had the most complicated response. He received the news with a thoughtful expression, took a long drink of his coffee, and then said, to no one in particular, "The kitchen's been better since October." This was from Sutter, the equivalent of a formal endorsement, and everyone at the table understood it as such. The wedding itself happened on a Saturday in late January, in the main room of the ranch house, with a circuit judge who came out from the county seat on Gideon's request. It was not a large ceremony. Ruth Varney came with her husband, who was a quiet, decent man who shook Gideon's hand with the slightly relieved air of someone glad to be on the right side of a thing. Theodore stood beside Gideon. Lydia had no one to stand beside her in that particular capacity, and she had made her peace with this. It was an accurate reflection of where she was in the world, and she had learned to be honest about accurate reflections rather than papering over them. What she hadn't expected was Caleb, who appeared at her elbow 10 minutes before the judge arrived and stood there with the stiff discomfort of a 19-year-old who had decided to do something formal and was not entirely sure how to carry it off. "I could," he started, stopped. "If you needed someone to, I don't know, stand on your side, I could do that." She looked at him. He was looking at the wall. His ears were red. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded with the excessive casualness of someone deeply relieved. "Fine," he said. "Good, that's fine." She did not make any more of it than that, because making more of it would have undone it, and she understood Caleb well enough by now to know that. The ceremony was short and direct, which suited both of them. The judge read the necessary words. Gideon said what needed to be said with the quiet certainty of a man who had decided something and was not interested in revisiting the decision. Lydia said what needed to be said and meant every word of it with the particular solidity of someone who had arrived at a yes through long and honest consideration rather than impulse. When it was done, Ruth Varney cried briefly and then looked annoyed at herself for doing so. Her husband produced a bottle of good whiskey that he'd apparently been hiding in his coat for this occasion. Theodore poured. Even Sutter had come in from the barn and was standing at the edge of the room with his hat in his hands and an expression that suggested he found the proceedings acceptable. It was not a perfect afternoon. The judge stayed too long and had opinions about territorial land law that he shared with more enthusiasm than the occasion required. One of the hands knocked over a chair. The whiskey ran out before everyone who wanted some had gotten it, which caused a minor negotiation. Lydia burned the edge of the celebration cake she'd made that morning because she'd been doing 17 other things and forgot to check it. She noticed the burned edge when she cut it and said, "The middle's fine," which it was. Gideon ate the piece with the burned edge without comment. She noticed this and said nothing about it, but she thought about it later in the way you think about small things that contain larger things inside them. The trial of Martin Delacroix took place in the county seat in April, when the mountain passes had cleared enough for the journey to be practical. Lydia had wondered, over the winter, how she would feel when that day came. She had assumed she would feel something large and definitive, vindication, or an anger fully expressed, or some version of resolution that had a clear shape to it. What she actually felt, riding to the county seat beside Gideon on a cold April morning with the mountains still white above them, was something more complicated and less satisfying than any of those things. She had been called as a witness. She had known this was coming. Birch had told her in January, had prepared her for what the proceedings would involve. She was not afraid of testifying. She had been telling the same true account for 6 months, and she knew it cold, and she was not a woman who lost herself under pressure. What she hadn't prepared for was seeing Martin Delacroix. He was in the courtroom when she arrived, seated at the defendant's table with a lawyer she didn't know, wearing a good coat that had seen better days, with the particular quality of a man who had spent several months renegotiating his own self-image. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was the same man, the same face, but in some other dimension, the dimension where a person's certainty about their own importance was visible, he had clearly undergone a significant reduction. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. She had thought for a long time that if she was ever in a room with Martin Delacroix again, she would want to say something to him. Something true and sharp that would land where it needed to land and leave a mark. Looking at him across the courtroom, she discovered that she didn't want to say anything to him at all. What she wanted was to do what she'd come to do, which was to tell a true account to people who were authorized to act on it, and then leave. This was not the dramatic confrontation she'd half imagined during the worst weeks at Mrs. Cobble's boarding house, but it was, she thought, considerably more useful. She testified for 40 minutes. She said what she'd seen, what she'd asked, what had been done to her in response. She said it clearly and without embellishment and without editorializing, because Birch had advised that juries trusted precision more than emotion, and she trusted Birch's advice. She was cross-examined by Delacroix's lawyer, who attempted several angles of approach and found none of them productive. She answered every question with the same measured accuracy she'd applied to her original letters. Gideon was in this gallery. She didn't look at him while she was testifying, but she knew where he was. When she stepped down, she did not look at Delacroix. The verdict came 3 days later, guilty on 11 of the 14 charges. The 3 charges that didn't result in convictions were technical matters involving the chain of evidence on the oldest claims, which Birch had anticipated and which did not materially affect the outcome. Martin Delacroix was sentenced to 4 years in the territorial prison and ordered to make restitution to the defrauded parties from the proceeds of a forced sale of his property. 4 years and restitution. Lydia stood outside the courthouse in the April sun and thought about whether this was justice. It was consequence, certainly. It was accountability, of a kind. Whether those things added up to justice depended on how you defined it, and she had lived long enough to know that the definition was a thing people argued about for good reasons. What she could say with certainty was that Edmund and Clara Forsyth, standing 20 feet away from her on the courthouse steps, would get their $240 back. She could say that 12 other families would receive some accounting for what had been taken from them. She could say that the fraudulent records had been corrected and the land titles reissued, and the official version of events now matched what had actually happened. Clara Forsyth saw her from across the steps and walked over with the directness of a woman who had decided to do a thing. "Mrs. Hale," she said. And she was in her 30s, plain-spoken and clear-eyed, the kind of woman who looked like she'd weathered things and come through them not unscathed, but upright. "Mrs. Forsyth," Lydia said. "I wanted to tell you myself," Clara said, "what it meant, what you did." "Ruth Varney came to you," Lydia said. "She's the one you should thank." "I thanked her," Clara said. "I'm thanking you too." She looked at Lydia steadily. "You didn't have to. You'd already been through enough. Most people in your situation would have kept their heads down and stayed out of it." "Most people wouldn't have seen the documents in the first place," Lydia said. "Maybe," Clara said, "but seeing them and doing something about them are different things. You know that." Lydia did know that. She had known it for a long time. "I hope things go well for you," she said. "For your family." "They will," Clara said, with a certainty that was not naive but earned, the certainty of a woman who had looked at a near disaster and concluded that she was capable of handling the real thing if it came. "I hope the same for you." Gideon appeared at Lydia's shoulder as Clara walked back to her husband. He said nothing. He simply stood there, which was, she had come to understand, his way of being present without requiring anything from the moment. 4 years, she said. "Yes," he said. "Is it enough?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "I don't know," he said. "It's what it is." She looked at the courthouse, at the April sky above it, at the mountains still visible on the horizon. "The 2 families who didn't get full restitution in Kansas City," she said, which was not what she'd meant to say, but the trial had loosened something. "I've thought about them for years." "I know," he said. "I can't fix that," she said. "No," he said. "You can't." He paused. "But you stopped it from happening here. To 12 more families." He said this not to console her, but because it was true, and he was a man who said true things. "That's not nothing either." She thought about her own words, said to him in the kitchen months ago. That's not nothing. He had retained it. He did that. Retained the things that mattered, filed them away in the careful manner of a man who did not take things lightly. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." They rode home the same day. Spring came to the Hale Ranch with the practical urgency it always brought. Fencing that had waited all winter, planting in the kitchen garden, the south herd moved to the summer pasture, the north fence repaired properly where the blizzard had taken it down. The ranch had survived the winter with 11 fewer cattle than it had started with, and margins that were tight but intact, and the spring had the particular energy of a place that had been tested and had held. The men had settled around Lydia's presence with the completeness of people who had stopped noticing it was new. She was simply the person who ran the house, who knew where everything was and when everything needed doing, who appeared in the yard sometimes when something required a second opinion, and who had opinions that were generally worth having. Caleb had stopped deferring to Sutter on kitchen matters, and had started, without announcement, deferring to her instead. Sutter remarkably, had not objected to this development, which she interpreted as his version of a profound concession. Walt had fixed 3 more things in the kitchen that hadn't been broken but were now better. She had thanked him once, directly, and he had looked so uncomfortable that she had not thanked him again, which he seemed to find considerably more manageable. Theodore remained Theodore, the quiet constant of the place, the man who knew everything and said only what was necessary, and whose presence at any given moment generally meant the right person was in the right place. He had taken to including Lydia in the morning reports he gave Gideon, simply adding her to the conversation as though this had always been the arrangement, which in the ways that mattered, it now was. Gideon himself was different in a way she noticed, but couldn't have precisely explained to anyone who asked. He was not looser, exactly. He was still the same direct, economical man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and did not waste energy on surfaces. But there was something in him that had been held very tightly for a long time, and was no longer held quite so tightly, and the difference was visible in small ways. The occasional evening where he sat in the kitchen past the point of practical necessity, the way he laughed, rarely, but genuinely, with the slightly surprised quality of a man rediscovering a capacity he'd thought was finished. She had done that, she supposed, or they had done it together. She was uncertain about the precise allocation of credit and thought it probably didn't matter. She wrote to her sister in Kansas City. This time, the letter did not require 17 drafts. She wrote that she was married, that she was well, that she was living on a ranch in the territory and running a household of 12 men and had discovered she was better at this than at anything she'd tried before, and that she hoped her sister was well and that she intended to write more often. She sent it with Theodore on his next Millfield run. Her sister wrote back within a month, a long letter full of news from Kansas City and a tone of profound relief at receiving correspondence that did not require reading between the lines for distress. She asked questions about Gideon, about the ranch, about what Lydia did all day. And the questions had the slightly incredulous warmth of someone who had worried for a long time and was now, tentatively, setting the worry down. Lydia wrote back and answered all the questions, including the one she suspected was the real one underneath all the others. "Are you happy?" She sat with this question for a while before she answered it. She was not, she thought, a person for whom happiness was the right word. Exactly. Happiness implied a settled brightness, an untroubled condition, and she had lived too much life to be untroubled. What she had was more like solidity, the sense of standing on ground that held, the sense of having built something that could bear weight. She had a husband who was honest with her and did not require her to be less than she was. She had a household she'd made functional, and a ranch she understood well enough to know when something was wrong and what to do about it. She had, slowly, imperfectly, without ceremony, made a place for herself in a world that had spent considerable energy trying to make it clear she didn't have one. She wrote back, "I am well. Better than well. Come visit next summer and see for yourself." Royce Calloway did not disappear from Blackstone's life, because men like Royce Calloway didn't disappear. They adjusted. He lost 2 more council votes in the spring elections, and his informal authority over the town's business arrangements contracted accordingly. But he remained a man of property and some standing, and Lydia did not expect or require his conversion. What she required was that he not actively work against the Hale Ranch's interests, and what she observed over the following year was that he had made a quiet calculation and concluded this was the more practical course. She did not trust him. She did not pretend to. But she had learned the difference between enemies who were contained and enemies who were active, and Calloway, by the following spring, was the contained variety. Van Aldrich came to her directly, in May, when she was in Blackstone for supplies. He found her at the dry goods store and removed his hat and apologized, formally, explicitly, with the discomfort of a man who did not apologize often, and found the experience physically painful. She accepted it with the politeness she'd told Ruth Varney she would apply, and without making it easier than it needed to be. He left looking slightly chastened and slightly relieved, which seemed to her about right. The seamstress on 3rd Street asked, tentatively, if Lydia might be interested in taking work again. Lydia thanked her and declined. She had more work than she could use. Edmund Forsyth, with his $240 returned and the land title now cleanly his, had moved his family onto the parcel in March. He came by the ranch once, in April, to return a piece of equipment he'd borrowed from Gideon and to say, Again, his inadequate version of what he felt. Lydia happened to be in the yard when he arrived. "I keep trying to find the right words," he said. "They don't exist," she said. "That's all right." He looked at the ranch, the repaired fences, the organized yard, the smoke from the kitchen chimney. "You made a good life here," he said. "I made the life that was available," she said, "and then I made it better than it was." He nodded slowly, like a man absorbing a piece of information that was also a piece of advice. She went back inside. There is something people don't tell you about starting over, which is that starting over is not actually the thing you do. Starting over implies you go back to a beginning, to a blank page, to some neutral place from which everything is equally possible. That is not what happens. What happens is that you carry what you are into, whatever comes next, and what comes next is shaped by the carrying, by all the things the years have made you, the mistakes and the recoveries, and the things you chose, and the things you didn't choose, and the specific kind of courage required to keep going when the going has cost you more than you thought you had to spend. Lydia Rowan had not started over. She had continued. That was a different thing, and harder in some ways. And the distinction mattered. She had brought her flaws with her difficulty trusting, even when trust was warranted, her tendency to account for everything, to turn every gift into a ledger entry, to find comfort in practicality when emotion felt too expensive. Her habit of carrying things alone past the point where carrying them alone was useful. She had not cured herself of any of these. She had learned to notice them, mostly, and to tell Gideon when she was doing it, which he received without treating it as a crisis, which helped. Gideon had brought his flaws too. His tendency to absorb damage privately until it became something else. His difficulty saying what he felt in time for it to matter, so that it came out in actions instead. Gate latches fixed, letters endorsed. A locked room offered to a woman the whole town had decided to discard. His particular stubbornness, which was mostly a virtue and occasionally an obstacle. His difficulty believing, still, sometimes, that he hadn't failed Eleanor in the ways he thought he had. They were two people with genuine flaws making a genuine life. And the life was not smooth or easy or without its difficult patches, and it was real in the way that only things earned the hard way tend to be real. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady way of things built on solid foundations. A new section of the south pasture fenced and brought into use. A second structure added to the main barn. A good year for the cattle market in 1888 that allowed Gideon to pay down the note on the east field 3 years earlier than planned. The crew changed a little. One man left for California, 2 new men came. Caleb stayed, which did not surprise Lydia. She thought he would be running his own operation within 10 years, and she intended to tell him so when the time felt right. She began, in the second year, to be consulted on the financial planning as well as the household management. This happened gradually and without formal announcement. Gideon began showing her the account books, then asking her opinion on purchasing decisions, then including her in conversations with Theodore about the seasonal planning. She had opinions. He had learned this. What she had not expected was that her opinions, more often than not, would change how decisions were made. She had not thought of herself as someone with a talent for the larger management of things. She had thought of herself as someone competent at the practical level, the household, the supplies, the immediate problem in front of her. What the ranch taught her, over 2 years of paying attention, was that the practical level and the larger level were the same level, if you looked at them right. Managing a household of 12 through a blizzard was not different in its essential structure from managing a ranch's finances through a hard year. It was the same discipline applied at different scales. Gideon said, one evening in the second autumn, looking at a set of accounts she'd reorganized into a format that made the seasonal patterns considerably clearer. "You should have been doing this from the beginning." "I was doing the thing you hired me to do," she said. "You were doing more than that," he said. "You always were." She thought about this for a moment. "So were you," she said. "You hired a housekeeper. You didn't have to defend her to the town. You didn't have to send a letter to a land attorney. You didn't have to walk into a boarding house and offer someone who'd been publicly discarded a job in a locked room." He looked at the accounts. "I did what seemed right," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." In the third year of their marriage, Blackstone held a town meeting about the water board allocation for the southern ranches, a recurring point of conflict that had never been adequately resolved. Gideon attended, Lydia came with him. This was not unremarkable. Women attended town meetings in Blackstone, but they attended them in the particular way of observers rather than participants, which was a distinction most people accepted without examining. Lydia had thought about this carefully before deciding to come, and she had decided to come because the water board allocation affected the Hale Ranch directly, and she understood the numbers involved better than she'd understood them at any point since her arrival. She sat next to Gideon. When the discussion turned to the specific formula being proposed for the allocation, and the man presenting it made a calculation error that compounded across the following 3 points in ways that were going to disadvantage the smaller southern operations, she said so. The room was briefly very quiet. She presented the correct calculation. She cited the figures. She waited. Royce Calloway, from across the room, said nothing. He looked at the table. She thought he was probably doing his own arithmetic and arriving at the same answer she had, which would mean acknowledging she was right, which she did not expect him to do publicly. The man presenting the formula looked at his paper for a long moment and then said quietly, "She's correct." He corrected the calculation. The discussion continued. Nobody said much about it afterward. A few people looked at her with the revised assessment expression she'd been accumulating for years. Ruth Varney, from across the room, gave her a small nod that contained a very great deal. On the ride home, Gideon said, "Calloway looked like he'd bitten something unpleasant." "He's a man who values the appearance of competence," she said. "It's uncomfortable when someone else demonstrates it in front of him. Especially someone he tried to run out of the territory," Gideon said. She thought about that. About the bank steps and the October sun and the crowd making up its mind. "He didn't run me out," she said. "No," Gideon said, "he didn't." They rode in the particular comfortable silence she had come to think of as one of the best things about being married to this man. The silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment and knew it. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last ridge. The smoke from the kitchen chimney, the repaired fences running clean lines across the hillside, the lights in the bunkhouse where the men were settling in for the evening. She had walked onto this property with 2 bags and $12 and a reputation that had been deliberately destroyed by a man who had calculated her silence was cheaper than her knowledge. He had miscalculated. Not because she had been stronger than he accounted for, or cleverer, or more resilient, though possibly some of those were true. He had miscalculated because he had looked at a woman with nothing left and concluded that nothing left meant nothing to lose. He hadn't understood that nothing left was sometimes the condition from which people did their most determined work. She had come here with nothing but what she was. And what she was had turned out to be enough. And then more than enough. And then something that the ranch and the man and the years had made into something she could not have described to the woman sitting at Mrs. Cobble's table doing arithmetic with diminishing options. That woman deserved to know how it ended. She deserved to know that the careful, frightened work of staying honest, even when honesty cost you everything, even when the people you told the truth to weren't ready to believe it, was not wasted. That it accumulated somewhere in ways you couldn't see while you were in the middle of it. That a locked room and a fair wage offered to someone everyone else had decided to discard was not a small thing. That the people who extended that kind of dignity in the face of every communal pressure to withdraw it were the people who held the world together at its most important seams. That 2 broken people, in the right circumstances, with enough honesty and enough stubbornness and enough willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier, could build something that neither of them could have built alone. The ranch, the life. The particular ongoing dailiness of it, with all its imperfections and frustrations and hard winters, and the occasional burned edge on a cake, and the men who needed managing, and the accounts that needed balancing, and the fences that always, in the end, needed fixing again. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than a fairy tale. It was real. Lydia Hale rode through the gate of the ranch she ran, beside the man she had chosen and who had chosen her, under a sky going gold and rose with the last of the autumn light, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something works. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it works. And for 2 people who had spent a long time wondering if anything would, that was